"You don't belong on this aircraft, and I'm going to make sure you don't stay." The woman's voice carried across the boarding area like a blade wrapped in silk, precise, unhurried, absolutely certain of its own authority. She was speaking to the gate agent, but the words were aimed at the man standing 6 feet away with a canvas duffel bag and a boarding pass he'd already shown twice. She had just reported a decorated combat veteran as a security threat. She did not know this. She would. The fluorescent lights at Gate C-17 of Raleigh-Durham International buzzed with the flat indifference of a Tuesday afternoon. March 16th, 2:22 p.m. Eastern. The overhead monitor displayed Flight 2274 to Reagan National. Boarding Zone 3, running 4 minutes behind schedule. The gate agent, a man in his early 40s with a name tag that read Holloway, T., and the particular posture of someone accustomed to enforcing rules he hadn't written, held a radio in one hand and a printed manifest in the other. He was looking at the man with the duffel bag the way customs officers look at luggage they intend to open. The man with the duffel bag stood near the boarding lane without urgency. 54 years old, 6'1", lean in the way that comes from decades of discipline rather than diet. His field jacket was faded olive, washed enough times that the fabric had lost its stiffness but not its shape. No logos, no patches, no insignia of any kind, just a jacket that had clearly been worn in conditions more demanding than an airport terminal. His boots were broken in, resoled once, clean but not polished. He held the boarding pass in his left hand. His right hand hung at his side, still, the fingers slightly curled, the resting posture of someone who'd trained those hands to be ready without appearing ready. He was watching the gate agent's hands. Specifically, he was watching which radio the agent reached for, the airline handset clipped to the podium, or the smaller unit on his belt that connected to airport operations. The distinction mattered, though no one around him understood why. The woman who had spoken, mid-50s, platinum blonde hair styled in a way that required maintenance appointments and the financial infrastructure to keep them, stood at the first-class priority lane with a rolling carry-on that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her diamond-tier loyalty tag dangled from the handle like a credential. She had approached the podium 90 seconds earlier, leaned in close enough that the gate agent could smell her perfume, and delivered her complaint with the rehearsed confidence of someone who had made similar complaints before and always been taken seriously. "Attention, passenger in Zone 4, Seat 22C. Please report to the podium for additional verification." The announcement came through the gate speaker with institutional neutrality. No name, no explanation, just a summons disguised as routine. The man with the duffel bag looked up. He did not look surprised. He folded his boarding pass along its original crease, a single, precise motion that took less than a second, and walked toward the podium without hurrying. He shifted the duffel to his left shoulder. The shoulder that still carried shrapnel no airport scanner had ever flagged. And he walked toward the podium the way he walked toward everything, steady, measured, already calculating what came next. If you're hooked by this opening, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. The podium was a small fortress of laminated procedures and blinking screens. Trent Holloway stood behind it with the particular authority of a man who controlled a bottleneck. Gate Agent Supervisor, 14 years with the airline. He'd processed tens of thousands of passengers through gates exactly like this one, and he'd learned to sort them into categories within seconds: compliant, difficult, and problem. The man approaching him had already been sorted into the third category, though Holloway could not have articulated why, if pressed. Something about the jacket, the bag, the boots, the way the man moved through an airport terminal as if he'd memorized the layout before arriving, or maybe it was simpler than that. Boarding pass and photo ID. The man produced both. North Carolina driver's license. Boarding pass printed at a kiosk, not pulled up on a phone. Holloway examined the license with the attention of someone looking for a reason rather than information. Desmond A. Kane. Address in Fayetteville. Date of birth, placing him at 54. The photo matched the face. The name matched the manifest. There was no reason to delay him. Holloway delayed him anyway. "One moment, sir. I need to verify something with the ticket counter." He picked up the podium phone and dialed a 3-digit internal extension. The conversation was brief, Holloway speaking low enough that only fragments carried. "Seat assignment, Zone 4. Passenger concern." He hung up and turned back to the man who had not moved, had not shifted his weight, had not asked what the problem was. "You're cleared aboard." He handed back the documents without making eye contact. The man took them, tucked the license into his jacket's interior pocket with the same muscle memory precision he'd used to fold the boarding pass, and turned toward the jetway. Behind him, Holloway reached for the smaller radio, the one on his belt, the one connected to operations, and keyed the transmit button. "Zone 4 passenger, seat 22C, flagging for secondary. No system alert. Passenger concern only. Requesting guidance." The response came back in 2 seconds. "Proceed standard boarding. No TSA hold." Holloway clipped the radio back to his belt. The man was already halfway down the jetway. The woman with the diamond loyalty tag was watching from the first-class lane with an expression that combined satisfaction and anticipation, the look of someone who had set machinery in motion and was waiting to see it work. Her name was Margot Linden. She lived in McLean, Virginia. She flew this route twice a month. She had called the airline's premium member line from the gate area 11 minutes earlier, before approaching Holloway, and reported, in language carefully calibrated to sound concerned rather than accusatory, that a suspicious individual near the boarding area was behaving erratically and appeared to be casing the gate. She had cited no specific behavior. She had provided a physical description that, stripped of its diplomatic cushioning, amounted to a black man in old clothes with a bag. The call was logged at 2:11 p.m. Complaint category: security concern. Specific behavior cited: none. Margot Linden had done this before. Not on this airline, not at this airport, but the motion was familiar. The lean toward authority, the lowered voice, the vocabulary of safety deployed in service of something that had nothing to do with safety. She boarded through the first-class lane and settled into seat 3A with the efficiency of someone who traveled enough to have the choreography memorized. Overhead bin, jacket folded once, noise-canceling headphones placed on the armrest within reach but not yet deployed. She glanced toward the coach cabin as other passengers filed past, locating the man from the gate area as he moved down the aisle toward the back of the aircraft. Row 22. Window seat. The man stowed his duffel in the overhead bin with a single controlled motion, one hand lifting, the other guiding, that placed the bag exactly where he wanted it on the first attempt. No adjusting, no reshuffling. The kind of efficiency that comes from packing and unpacking the same bag thousands of times in conditions where speed mattered. He sat down, buckled the seatbelt, pulled a folded letter from his jacket's inner pocket, handwritten, on paper that had been creased and recreased so many times the folds were soft as fabric. He held it in both hands but did not read it. He already knew what it said. He held it the way someone holds a photograph of a person they're about to bury. Around him, the aircraft filled with the ordinary sounds of boarding. Overhead bins opening and closing. The synthetic chime of seatbelt signs. A child 3 rows up asking if the plane would go above the clouds. A flight attendant's voice cycling through pre-departure announcements with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd delivered them 10,000 times. Normal. All of it normal. Except for the man in 22C who sat perfectly still with a letter in his hands and a duffel bag above him and 37 years of service to a country that kept finding new ways to ask whether he belonged. He did not know about the complaint, did not know his name was flagged in the airline's passenger concern system. did not know that the woman in 3A had already planted the seed for what was coming, or that the gate agent's radio call had set a sequence in motion that would escalate through 4 layers of authority before the aircraft ever left the ground. He was thinking about a funeral, about Staff Sergeant Raymond Okafor, who had died 11 days ago at Walter Reed from complications related to injuries sustained 17 years earlier in Fallujah, about the weight of a man's body carried across 400 meters of ground where every step could be the last, about the promise he'd made in a field hospital with morphine wearing off and the sound of helicopters overhead, the promise that if Raymond ever needed carrying again, he'd be there. He was keeping that promise, flying coach to Arlington because the VA travel benefit had been denied twice on paperwork technicalities, and he'd bought the ticket himself with money that should have gone to the electricity bill. Wearing the field jacket because it was the only coat he owned that still fit the way his body had learned to expect a coat to fit. Close at the shoulders, loose at the waist, pockets positioned where hands could find them without looking. He folded the letter back along its creases, tucked it into the pocket, sat with his back against the seat and his hands on the armrests, palms down, fingers still, watching, waiting. Not for anything in particular, just the habit of a man who had spent decades in places where the difference between watching and not watching was the difference between going home and not going home. 3 rows ahead, a woman repositioned her purse to the far side of her seat when he'd walked past. He'd noticed, said nothing, written nothing. Some things didn't need documenting because they happened so often that documentation would become a second full-time job. But the notebook was in his jacket pocket, the one with the black cover and the pages that didn't bleed when written on with the particular pen he carried, a pen with a clip designed to attach to a breast pocket, the kind issued in bulk by institutions that required a lot of writing in bad conditions. The notebook contained dates, times, locations, and observations recorded in handwriting so precise it looked typeset. Not because he expected to need the information, because recording observations was what he did the way breathing was what he did. Automatically, continuously, the baseline operation of a mind that had been trained to treat every environment as a potential report. At 2:31 p.m., a woman in the airline's Navy uniform walked down the aisle from the first-class galley. Her name tag read Pryor, J. Flight Attendant. She was 32, wire-thin, with the particular alertness of someone who had recently received instructions she didn't fully agree with but intended to follow anyway. She passed row 22 without stopping, but her eyes moved to the man in the window seat, then to his overhead bin, then back to the galley. A reconnaissance pass disguised as cabin check. At 2:34 p.m., Margot Linden pressed the call button from seat 3A. The chime sounded, a single clear note that carried no urgency but commanded response. Pryor reversed course and walked forward. The conversation happened at Margot's seat level, Pryor crouching slightly, Margot speaking with her hand partially covering her mouth, the universal posture of someone sharing information they wanted to appear reluctant to share. "I need to speak with you privately about a passenger." Pryor listened. Her expression stayed neutral in the way that customer service training teaches, engaged but non-committal, a face designed to neither validate nor dismiss. Margot's words were inaudible to anyone more than 3 feet away, but the shape of them was visible, urgent, clipped, punctuated by small gestures toward the rear of the aircraft. The word safe appeared twice. The word concerned appeared 3 times. Pryor straightened, made a note on the tablet she carried, the airline's in-cabin reporting system, where passenger issues were logged in real time and uploaded to the operations database when the aircraft connected to ground Wi-Fi. The note would become evidence later, though Pryor did not know this yet. Nobody on this aircraft knew what any of this would become. "I'll speak with the captain," Pryor said, and walked toward the cockpit. 2:37 p.m. The cockpit door was closed. She knocked twice. The man in 22C watched her walk forward. He watched the knock. He watched the door open 3 inches. Enough for words, not enough for entry. He could not hear what was said, but he could read the body language. The flight attendant's posture shifted from neutral to something harder, the stiffness of someone relaying a message that had weight. The door opened wider. She stepped partially inside. The door closed behind her. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the black notebook, opened it to a fresh page, wrote, March 16th, 2:37 p.m., F. A. Pryor spoke with cockpit after conversation with PAX 3A duration at cockpit door, approximately 90 seconds. Closed the notebook, returned it to his pocket, placed his hands back on the armrests. This was not the first time someone had complained about his presence. It was not even the first time on an airplane. 18 months ago, a woman on a flight from Charlotte to Chicago had asked to be reseated because he made her uncomfortable. The flight attendant on that occasion had moved the woman without comment, without apology to either party, without acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. The interaction had lasted 45 seconds. It had cost him nothing except a small, familiar erosion of something he'd stopped trying to name. He'd learned over decades that naming the erosion didn't stop it, didn't slow it, didn't make it easier to carry. So he'd stopped naming it and started documenting it instead. Dates, times, locations, the precise language used when language was used, the precise silence when silence was chosen. The notebook was volume 14. Volumes 1 through 13 were in a fireproof box in his apartment in Fayetteville, arranged chronologically, spanning 31 years. 31 years of being watched while watching. At 2:41 p.m., Pryor returned from the cockpit. She walked to the first-class galley, picked up the intercom handset, and made an announcement that had no operational purpose, but served a strategic one. Ladies and gentlemen, we're completing our final pre-departure checks. Please ensure all carry-on items are properly stowed and your seatbelts are fastened. We'll be closing the aircraft door shortly. The announcement was cover. While passengers adjusted and settled, Pryor moved through the cabin conducting what appeared to be a standard compliance check. Bins closed, seatbelts visible, tray tables up. But her route was specific. She started at row 22 and worked forward, rather than the standard front-to-back pattern. She stopped at the overhead bin above 22C, reached up, opened it. Just making sure everything's secure up here. She smiled at the man in the window seat, the professional smile, the one that revealed nothing except training. Her hands moved inside the bin, adjusting his duffel bag, shifting it slightly to the left. The motion took 4 seconds. When she closed the bin, she moved on to row 21 without pausing. The man in 22C had watched her hands. Specifically, he'd watched her right hand, which had entered the bin empty and exited the bin empty, but had paused for half a second against the exterior pocket of his duffel bag. The pause was brief enough to be meaningless, or brief enough to be deliberate. The distinction between those two interpretations would matter later. He opened the notebook, wrote, 2:41 p.m., F.A. Pryor opened overhead bin 22, adjusted duffel, right-hand contact with exterior pocket, approximately 0.5 seconds. No passenger request for bin adjustment. Closed the notebook. At 2:44 p.m., the aircraft door was sealed. The jetway retracted with its mechanical groan. The cabin settled into the particular quiet that exists between door closure and pushback, a held breath, a pause between one state and another. Outside the window, a baggage cart crossed the tarmac. A ground crew member in an orange vest gave the thumbs up to the cockpit. At 2:47 p.m., instead of the pushback announcement, the cockpit door opened again. This time, it wasn't Pryor who emerged. It was a man the passengers hadn't seen. Mid-30s, dark suit, no airline uniform. He carried a tablet and walked with the particular purpose of someone who had authority that didn't require explanation. His name was Kirk Neville, Corporate Security Liaison. He'd been deadheading on this flight, repositioning to Reagan for a meeting at the airline's D.C. Operations Center, and had been summoned to the cockpit by the captain after Pryor's briefing. Neville walked down the aisle with the tablet held in front of him like a clipboard. He stopped at row 22. "Sir, I'm with Corporate Security. We've received a passenger concern, and I need to ask you a few questions." The man in the window seat looked up. His expression did not change. The transition from stillness to engagement was seamless. No surprise, no anger, no visible adjustment. Just steady eyes meeting steady eyes. "Am I being accused of a specific violation?" The question landed in the cabin like a stone in still water. The passengers in rows 20 and 21 stopped their pre-departure fidgeting. The woman in 23B looked up from her phone. Neville's expression flickered, the briefest contraction of muscles around his eyes, the involuntary response of someone who expected a different kind of answer. "This is precautionary. Can you tell me your purpose of travel?" "A funeral." "I'm sorry to hear that. Can you verify the name on your ticket matches your ID?" "You have my boarding pass on your screen. It was verified at the gate. And again in the jetway by your supervisor, Mr. Holloway. This is the third verification in 40 minutes. Neville glanced at his tablet. The passenger's record was clean. TSA pre-check. No flags. No watch list. No prior incidents. The ticket had been purchased 12 days ago with a personal credit card. Seat selection. Window, rear coach. The profile of someone who wanted to be left alone. "I understand this is inconvenient." "It's not inconvenient. It's irregular. Your airline's Passenger Concern Response Protocol, Section 7, Subsection B, limits corporate security to identity verification during pre-departure. You've moved past verification into interrogation of travel purpose, which exceeds the scope of that protocol." Silence. Neville stared at the man. The man stared back. There was nothing hostile in the exchange. No raised voices, no physical tension. But the balance of the conversation had shifted in a direction Neville didn't control, and the passengers within earshot could feel it. The man in the worn field jacket and resoled boots had just cited the airline's internal security protocol by section and subsection, and he'd done it the way someone reads a street sign, without effort, without hesitation, as if the information had always been there. The question that should have followed, "How do you know our internal protocols?" stayed in Neville's throat. He swallowed it, made a note on his tablet, stepped back. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir. Enjoy your flight." He walked back toward the cockpit. The man in 22C watched him go, then opened the notebook. 2:47 p.m. Corp Security Neville, K approached 22C. Questions re: identity, third verification, and travel purpose. Exceeded PCRP 7-B scope. Duration, approx 2 minutes 40 seconds. At 2:53 p.m., Margot Linden pressed the call button again. This time, Pryor didn't go to her. Another flight attendant, senior, male, gray at the temples, answered the call. The conversation was brief. Margot's voice carried farther this time, her composure loosening at the edges. "I'm not being cautious for no reason. I've been flying this route for 9 years. I know what normal looks like, and that," she gestured toward the rear of the aircraft, "is not normal." The senior flight attendant nodded in the way that training teaches, acknowledgement without agreement. He returned to the galley and spoke to Pryor in a voice too low to carry. But the shape of the conversation was visible. Pryor shaking her head slightly, the senior attendant glancing toward row 22, both of them performing the calculus that airline employees perform when a premium passenger's complaint collides with a coach passenger's rights. The calculus, historically, did not favor coach. At 2:57 p.m., Margot Linden unbuckled her seatbelt, stood, and walked down the aisle. She stopped at row 21, leaned toward the couple seated there, white, mid-60s, matching windbreakers that suggested they were traveling together for leisure. Her voice was low, but not low enough. "I just want you to know, I've raised a concern with the crew about the gentleman behind you. I don't want to alarm anyone, but I think we should all be aware." The couple looked at each other, looked at Margot, looked briefly toward row 22. The man in the window seat was holding his letter again, not reading it, just holding it. "What kind of concern?" the man in 21A asked. "I'd rather not say more. Just be aware, if you see anything." She moved on. Row 20, row 19. The same lean, the same lowered voice, the same carefully constructed frame of civic responsibility wrapped around something that had nothing to do with civic responsibility. She was building consensus, manufacturing a shared perception, turning her individual discomfort into collective certainty through repetition and social proof. By 3:02 p.m., 4 passengers near row 22 had been briefed by Margot Linden. 2 of them requested seat changes. The requests were made to Pryor, who accommodated them without asking why, without noting the pattern, without questioning why 2 passengers in the same section simultaneously wanted to move away from a man who was sitting silently with a letter in his hands. The man in 22C watched the seat changes happen. He watched the couple in 21 gather their belongings and relocate to row 14. He watched a woman in 20C, young, maybe 25, earbuds in, glance at him with the particular expression of someone who had been told something alarming about a stranger and was now looking for evidence to confirm it. She found none. She moved anyway. He did not react, did not speak, did not adjust his posture or soften his expression, or perform any of the small social accommodations that black men in America learn to deploy when white discomfort fills a space like gas filling a room. He simply sat, watched, and wrote in the notebook. 2:57 to 3:02 p.m., Pax Linden, 3A, circulated through rows 19 to 22, spoke to minimum 4 passengers. 2 seat changes requested immediately after. No crew member questioned pattern. At 3:05 p.m., the aircraft still had not pushed back. The delay was not mechanical. The engines were ready. The ground crew was ready. The weather was clear. The slot was open. The delay was human. Specifically, it was the captain waiting for a resolution to the passenger concern that had been escalated through 2 layers of airline authority and had produced no actionable finding, but also no definitive closure. The captain's name was Julian Mercer, 61 years old, 34 years with the airline, former Navy aviator, F/A-18 Hornets, off the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, Desert Storm, and Southern Watch, 1,200 carrier landings. He'd transitioned to commercial aviation in 1996 and had flown every route the airline operated. He was methodical, unflappable, and deeply aware that his authority over this aircraft was absolute within the boundaries of federal aviation law. He was also aware that the complaint against the passenger in 22C was empty. He'd reviewed the file Neville had compiled. Clean record, valid ticket, TSA cleared, no behavioral indicators. The complaint from the premium passenger cited no specific action, no specific statement, no specific threat, only a feeling and a physical description that correlated with nothing except the complainant's own assumptions. Under 49 U.S.C. Section 44,902, Mercer had the authority to refuse transport to any passenger he determined to be a threat to the safety of the flight. The standard was reasonable belief. A feeling from another passenger was not reasonable belief. A physical description was not reasonable belief. 14 years of flying this route was not reasonable belief. Mercer picked up the intercom handset and made the pushback announcement. The aircraft began to move. But the machinery that Margot Linden had set in motion was not finished. It had entered the airline system through the complaint log. It had been amplified by Holloway's radio flag, Pryor's cockpit briefing, and Neville's in-cabin interview. And it had reached a node in the system that none of them controlled, the airline's ground operations center, where a duty manager reviewing real-time cabin reports saw the flag on Flight 2274 and made a call to the airport police substation at RDU. At 3:09 p.m., 4 minutes after pushback, the captain received a radio communication from ground control. Flight 2274, hold on taxiway Bravo. Airport police request return to gate. Mercer's hand tightened on the throttle. He looked at his first officer, Amara Solis, 38, 10 years with the airline, former Air Force C-17 pilot. Her expression mirrored his. In 34 years of flying, Mercer had been asked to return to gate for a passenger issue exactly 3 times. Each time, there had been a specific, documented threat. A passenger making verbal threats to crew. A passenger discovered intoxicated after boarding. A passenger found to be on the no-fly list due to a database delay. None of those situations applied here. Ground, Flight 2274, requesting nature of police request. 2274, airport police cite an unresolved passenger security concern. Request return to Charlie-17. Mercer looked at Solis. Solis looked back. The communication between them was the kind that develops between people who've spent thousands of hours in a confined space making consequential decisions, a language of glances and micro-expressions that carried more information than words. Ground 2274, returning to Charlie-17. The aircraft turned on the taxiway. The cabin, which had settled into the resigned patience of departure, stirred with confusion. Passengers looked out windows, looked at each other, looked at the flight attendants whose own confusion was visible beneath their professional composure. The PA system clicked on. Mercer's voice, calm and practiced. "Folks, this is your captain. We've been asked to return to the gate briefly to resolve an administrative matter. Shouldn't take long. We appreciate your patience." Administrative matter, the language of institutions when they don't want to name what's actually happening. The man in 22C put the letter back in his pocket. He knew, not the specifics, not who had called, not what had been said, not which authority had been invoked. But he knew the shape of it, the way a person who has been through enough storms knows the feel of the air before the rain starts. Something had been set in motion, and it was coming to his row. He placed his hands on the armrests, palms down, fingers still. Breathing slow and measured. The breathing pattern of someone who'd been trained to regulate their physiological response to stress, to keep heart rate below threshold, even when the situation demanded the opposite. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The rhythm of a man who had faced situations where panic meant death and calm meant survival, and who had chosen calm so many times that it wasn't a choice anymore but a condition. The aircraft docked at Gate C-17. The jetway extended. The forward door opened. At 3:17 p.m., Sergeant Boyd Orbach of the RDU Airport Police walked onto the aircraft. He was 46. Stocky, with the build of someone who'd been athletic in his 20s and had maintained enough of it in his 40s to project physical authority. Badge number 3344. 14 years with airport police, the last 6 as a sergeant. He walked down the aisle with his right hand resting on his equipment belt. Not on his weapon, not on his radio, but in the neutral zone between them where both were accessible. The posture of a man who wanted to appear prepared without appearing aggressive. He stopped at row 22. "Sir, I need you to step off the aircraft." The cabin contracted. The words pulled attention from every row within earshot, which was most of them, because the aircraft was a single-aisle regional jet and voices carried in it the way voices carry in hallways. "On what grounds?" The man's voice was level, not loud, not soft, pitched at the exact volume that carried to the nearest rows without projecting to the rest of the cabin. The voice of someone who understood acoustics, who'd spoken in rooms where volume and clarity could be the difference between a message received and a message lost. Orbach shifted his weight. The airline has requested your removal under 49 U.S.C. Section 44,902. The captain may refuse transport based on a reasonable determination of threat. Has the captain made that determination? The statute number hung in the recycled cabin air like a held note. Orbach's jaw moved, a small lateral motion, the physical manifestation of a man recalculating. Passengers in nearby rows were watching openly now. The woman in 23B had her phone angled in a way that might have been recording or might have been coincidence. The couple who had moved from row 21 to row 14 were craning their necks. I'm asking you to step off voluntarily. I'm declining. I have a valid ticket. I've cleared TSA screening. I've committed no violation of federal aviation regulation or airline policy. If you remove me involuntarily, I'll need your badge number, the incident report number, and the specific regulation cited for the removal. The words came out in a sequence that was clearly practiced, not rehearsed in the theatrical sense, but practiced the way someone practices procedures. Muscle memory applied to language. The man had said these words before, or words like them, in situations like this one, enough times that the delivery was smooth and automatic and stripped of emotion. Orbach's hand moved from the neutral zone on his belt to his radio. He keyed the transmit button. Dispatch, Sergeant Orbach, requesting backup at Gate C-17, aircraft interior. Passenger is non-compliant with voluntary removal request. Non-compliant. The word that transforms a citizen exercising a legal right into a problem requiring force. The response came in 8 seconds. Copy, Sergeant. Unit en route. Orbach turned back to the man in 22C. Sir, I'm giving you one more opportunity to step off this aircraft voluntarily. If you decline, you will be removed, and you may face charges for interfering with a flight crew. I haven't interfered with anyone. I'm seated. My seatbelt is fastened. I've answered every question asked of me. I've provided identification 3 times. I've been cooperative at every stage of this process. What I haven't done is abandon my legal right to occupy a seat I paid for based on an unsubstantiated complaint that cites no specific behavior. His voice dropped on the last phrase, not louder, but deeper, carrying a weight that made the entire forward section of the cabin go quiet. Even Margot Linden, 16 rows ahead, stopped adjusting her headphones and listened. If this story is making your blood boil, wait, it's about to get much worse. Stay with us. At 3:21 p.m., the second officer arrived, younger, early 30s, moving with the quick energy of someone who'd been told a situation was developing and wanted to be part of it. His name tag read, Banks. He positioned himself in the aisle at row 20, blocking the path between the man and the front of the aircraft. Orbach leaned closer to row 22. His voice dropped to a register intended to convey finality. Last chance, sir. Walk off or we remove you. The man in 22C stood. He stood the way he'd sat, without waste, without hesitation, without the small preliminary movements that most people make before rising from a seat. One moment seated, the next standing, the transition so fluid it looked rehearsed. He was taller than Orbach by 3 inches, and the field jacket hung from his shoulders with the particular drape of clothing on a frame that was accustomed to carrying weight. He reached for the overhead bin. Orbach's hand closed around his arm. The grip was firm, not brutal, but firm enough to stop motion, to assert physical control, to communicate through pressure what words had failed to achieve. The man's arm froze mid-reach. His head turned. He looked at Orbach's hand wrapped around his forearm. Then he looked at Orbach's face. Remove your hand. 2 words that didn't need volume because they carried something volume couldn't replicate. The voice of a man who had issued orders in conditions where disobedience meant death, Not the performative authority of someone accustomed to compliance, but the real thing, forged in places where authority was earned through demonstrated willingness to walk into fire and bring people back out. I am complying with your instruction. I am standing. I am reaching for my bag. There is no justification for physical contact. Orbach's hand stayed for 1 second. 2. 3. The cabin was absolutely silent. The ventilation system hummed. The overhead lights buzzed. Somewhere in first class, a phone vibrated against a tray table. Orbach released the arm. The man reached into the overhead bin, retrieved his duffel, settled it on his left shoulder, the shoulder with the shrapnel, and stepped into the aisle. He walked toward the front of the aircraft with the steady, unhurried gait of someone who had walked out of worse places than this and knew he would walk out of this one too. As he passed row 14, the couple who had moved from row 21 looked up at him. The woman's expression was complicated, something between shame and residual fear, the look of someone who had participated in something they were beginning to understand. As he passed row 6, an older man in the aisle seat, silver-haired, 70-something, wearing a VA Medical Center polo that was faded from years of washing, looked up. Their eyes met. The older man's name was Vernon Pace, retired VI. A nurse, 30 years at Walter Reed and the Durham 5A. He had spent 3 decades caring for men who moved the way this man moved. The controlled stride, the weight on the good leg, the shoulders that carried invisible loads. Vernon's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with recognition. Not of the face, he didn't recognize the face, but of the type, the bearing, the carriage. The way the man's eyes swept the cabin as he walked, cataloging exits and obstacles and human positions with the automated efficiency of someone for whom situational awareness wasn't a skill but a survival reflex. Vernon had seen that walk 10,000 times, in the corridors of Ward 7, in the rehabilitation rooms where men learned to use prosthetic limbs, in the parking lots where they sat in their cars for 30 minutes after appointments, because the transition from the clinical world to the civilian world required decompression. He knew what he was looking at. He just didn't know the rank. The man reached the front of the aircraft and stepped into the jetway. Orbach followed. Banks followed Orbach. The aircraft door remained open, a portal between the controlled environment of the cabin and the no-man's land of the jetway, where encounters like this one played out in a space that belonged to neither the airline nor the terminal, but existed in the jurisdictional gray zone between them. In the jetway, the light was different. Fluorescent tubes in the ceiling cast everything in the flat, white wash that strips dimension from faces and makes everyone look tired. The corrugated walls amplified sound. Footsteps echoed. Voices carried. Orbach positioned himself between the man and the terminal door. Banks stood 2 paces behind the man, forming a bracketing formation, a standard containment posture taught in law enforcement academies, designed to limit a subject's movement options without requiring physical contact. ID. The man produced his driver's license. Again. 4th time. Orbach examined it. Again. Photographed it with his phone. Called dispatch. Running a name. Kane Desmond A. Date of birth, November 3, 1971. North Carolina license. The dispatch response took 45 seconds. 45 seconds of standing in a jetway with 2 armed officers and the low vibration of an aircraft engine behind him, and the fluorescent light making everything sharp and flat and stripped of mercy. No warrants, no flags, no watch list entries. Record clean. Orbach lowered the radio, looked at the license, looked at the man. The calculation was visible. The narrowing of options, the realization that the machinery he'd been asked to operate had no justification for its own operation. The complaint was empty. The record was clean. The man had committed no violation. The airline had cited no specific threat. The captain had made no formal refusal to transport determination. And yet here they were, in a jetway, with an aircraft full of passengers watching the door, with a sequence of events that had started with a woman's feeling and escalated through 5 layers of institutional response to produce exactly this moment: a black man standing with a duffel bag and a letter and 2 police officers, and no reason for any of them to be where they were. So why does a passenger with a clean record and a valid ticket get 3 complaints in 40 minutes? Orbach's voice was different now. Not softer. He wasn't the type for softness, but slower. The voice of a man thinking out loud, processing a discrepancy he hadn't expected to find. "That's the right question, Sergeant." The man's voice was steady. "I'd encourage you to ask the people who filed them." They stood there. Orbach calculating. Banks waiting for instruction. The man with the duffel bag standing in the posture he'd maintained throughout, hands visible, weight balanced, breathing controlled. A posture that was both completely compliant and completely impenetrable. "You're free to reboard," Orbach said finally. The man didn't move immediately. He looked at Orbach. "Your badge number." 3344. "And the incident report number for this encounter." Orbach's jaw did the lateral thing again. "There isn't one yet." "Then I'd recommend generating one." A passenger was removed from an aircraft based on complaints that cited no specific behavior, subjected to 4 identity verifications, physically contacted during a compliant exit, and detained in a jetway while a criminal background check was conducted. That sequence has documentation value. The words weren't angry, weren't accusatory. They were clinical, the precise, dispassionate language of someone who understood exactly what had happened, exactly what laws governed it, and exactly what the documentation trail would need to look like when the appropriate authorities reviewed it. Orbach stared at him for 5 seconds, then pulled out a notepad and wrote a number, tore the page out and handed it to the man. "That's a case reference. You can request the full report through Airport Police Administration within 72 hours. The man took the paper, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket with the letter and the notebook and the boarding pass and the license, all the documents that institutions had demanded and examined and returned and demanded again, layered together in the same pocket like geological strata of an afternoon's accumulated institutional suspicion. He turned and walked back toward the aircraft. As he stepped through the door, the cabin went quiet again. Every eye found him. He walked down the aisle toward row 22, past the galley where Pryor stood with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable, past first class where Margot Linden was studying her phone with the concentrated attention of someone who refused to look up, past row 14, where the relocated couple tracked him with the heavy gaze of complicity, past row 6, where Vernon Pace watched him with the quiet intensity of a man assembling a picture from scattered pieces. He stowed the duffel, sat down, buckled the seatbelt, placed his hands on the armrests. The aircraft door closed. But before the pushback could resume, something happened that no one expected. The cockpit door opened, not the 3-inch gap of a briefing exchange. The door opened fully, and First Officer Amara Solis stepped into the cabin. She was in full uniform, white shirt, epaulettes, wings pinned above the left breast pocket. She walked through the first-class galley and into the main cabin with a purpose that parted the recycled air in front of her. Her stride was measured, but urgent, the walk of someone who had just seen something on her screen that changed the calculus of this entire situation. She stopped at the galley, looked at Pryor, spoke 3 words, low enough that no passenger heard them, firm enough that Pryor's eyes widened. Then Solis turned and walked down the aisle. She passed row 6. Vernon Pace looked up. She passed row 14. The relocated couple looked up. She passed row 19, 20, 21. Passengers who had been briefed by Margot Linden looked up. She stopped at row 22. The man in the window seat looked up at her. Their eyes met. Solis's face went through a transformation that everyone in the surrounding rows could see, but no one could interpret. A rapid sequence of recognition, shock, and something that might have been reverence, or might have been grief, or might have been the particular expression that occurs when you see someone whose story you know, but whose face you've only seen in photographs. She stood very still. Then she straightened, pulled her shoulders square, and nodded, a small, precise nod that carried weight far beyond its physical dimension. "Mr. Kane?" She used his name. Not sir, in the dismissive airline sense, not passenger, his name. And she said it the way someone says the name of a person they've been told about, a name that means something in contexts this cabin could not yet understand. The man looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but awareness. The awareness of someone who had been recognized by someone who should not have been able to recognize him. "Ma'am," he said, quiet, careful. Solis held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Her hands were shaking slightly, visible only because the fluorescent light caught the tremor as she passed under the overhead panels. The cockpit door closed behind her. The cabin hummed with confused energy. Passengers exchanged glances. What just happened? Why did the first officer walk to the back of the plane to address one passenger by name? Why did her face look like that? Why were her hands shaking? In row 22, the man placed the letter back in his jacket pocket. His expression had not changed, but his breathing had. One deep inhale, held for a count that no one else could measure, then released slowly through his nose. The breathing of a man recalibrating. In row 6, Vernon Pace pulled out his phone, opened a text thread with a contact labeled Jim, VA Admin. Typed slowly with 2 thumbs. "Something happening on this flight. Think I recognize the type. Not sure of specifics. We'll call when we land." He held the phone for 10 seconds. Did not send the text. Set the phone face down on his thigh and waited. In seat 3A, Margot Linden watched the cockpit door and felt, for the first time since boarding, the faint vibration of doubt. The first officer's walk. The nod. The name. These were not the responses of a crew handling a security threat. These were the responses of a crew handling something else entirely, something that Margot's framework of suspicion had no category for. She pushed the doubt aside. She was not a woman who entertained doubt. She was a woman who entertained certainty, and her certainty was that the man in 22C did not belong on her flight, and the fact that the first officer apparently disagreed was a problem with the first officer, not a problem with Margot's assessment. She pressed the call button again. It chimed. No one answered. At 3:29 p.m., the aircraft pushed back for the second time. The engines spooled. The taxi resumed. The safety demonstration played on the overhead screens while Pryor mouthed the words without hearing them. Her attention split between the cabin and the closed cockpit door and the overhead bin above row 22, where something was or wasn't sitting next to a canvas duffel bag. Because Pryor had a decision to make. The item she'd placed on the duffel bag during her bin check, a small electronics pouch from the airline's onboard inventory, containing a spare set of earbuds and a charging cable, was either going to be discovered during the flight and attributed to the passenger, or it was going to be quietly retrieved and returned to inventory before anyone asked questions. The decision depended on what happened next, on whether the passenger would be an ongoing problem, on whether the first officer's strange behavior in the aisle would change the crew's disposition toward the complaint, on whether Margot Linden's persistence would maintain its institutional momentum or collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. Pryor didn't know yet. She was waiting for a signal, from the captain, from Neville, from the system of authority that had told her to watch and adjust and be ready. The system hadn't told her to plant the pouch. That had been her own calculation, an insurance policy against the possibility that the passenger's compliance and clean record would neutralize the complaint before it achieved its intended result. She was not a malicious person. She was a strategic one. She had learned, in 7 years of aviation service, that passenger complaints from premium members carried weight that transcended their content, and that career advancement in the airline industry was correlated less with competence than with the ability to make high-value customers feel heard. Margot Linden was a very high-value customer, and she wanted the man in 22C gone. The aircraft reached the runway. The engines roared. The acceleration pressed passengers into their seats with the democratic force of physics. First class and coach, and the man in 22C and the woman in 3A all pushed backward with identical pressure, indistinguishable in the eyes of gravity. At 3:33 p.m., Flight 2274 lifted off from Raleigh-Durham International. Wheels up. Gear retracted. The Earth fell away. In the cockpit, Captain Mercer flew the departure with 34 years of habit, while his mind processed what Solis had told him after she returned from the cabin. She'd accessed the DoD coordination file, a database the airline maintained for flights carrying active duty or retired military personnel whose travel was flagged through the Department of Defense travel system. The database was rarely consulted. Most military passengers traveled without fanfare, anonymous in coach seats with duffel bags and short haircuts, and the quiet discipline of people accustomed to moving through systems without drawing attention. Solis had consulted the database after the police encounter, after the third verification, after watching a man get removed from an aircraft for the crime of sitting quietly with a letter in his hands. She'd typed the name Kane Desmond A. into the search field and watched the screen fill with information that reorganized everything she thought she knew about the situation unfolding in row 22. What she found changed the temperature of the cockpit. She hadn't told Mercer everything, not yet. She'd said 3 words, enough to make him pause, enough to make him look at her with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd been complicit in something that was about to become very visible. 3 words that made him reconsider the complaint, the flag, the police, the jetway, the entire architecture of institutional response that had been built around a man whose only offense was existing in a space where someone didn't want him to exist. 3 words that made him want to do something he hadn't done in 34 years of commercial aviation. But not yet. The timing wasn't right. They were climbing through 12,000 feet. The seatbelt sign was still on, and the crew was still performing post-departure procedures. What Mercer was planning required the aircraft to be stable, the cabin to be settled, and the moment to be precisely calibrated for maximum impact. Because Julian Mercer was many things, methodical, cautious, bound by regulation. But he was also a Navy aviator who'd served alongside men and women whose sacrifices he carried in his memory the way the man in 22C carried shrapnel in his shoulder. And what had been done to that man on his aircraft was an offense that Mercer's particular code of honor could not let stand without response. The aircraft climbed. The seatbelt sign stayed on. The cabin settled into the uneasy quiet of a flight that everyone aboard knew was different from a normal flight, though no one except Solis and Mercer knew exactly how different it was about to become. In row 22, the man held the letter. The letter that said things about sacrifice and brotherhood and the weight of promises kept across decades. The letter that was taking him to Arlington to bury a man he'd carried out of hell and who had finally, after 17 years of surgeries and rehabilitation and the slow arithmetic of war wounds, succumbed to the injuries that should have killed him in Fallujah, but didn't, because a colonel had refused to leave him behind. Staff Sergeant Raymond Okafor, 39 years old, born in Lagos, raised in Fayetteville, enlisted at 18, deployed at 20, wounded at 22, in a city whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce, but whose streets were etched into the memory of every soldier who'd fought there. 17 years of recovery, that was also 17 years of dying by degrees. Each surgery buying time, each complication stealing it. The trajectory always pointing toward the same destination, but the journey taking long enough that hope became a habit and loss became a surprise even though it shouldn't have been. The man in 22C had visited Raymond every month for 17 years, had driven from Fayetteville to Walter Reed and back, 11 hours round trip, with the regularity of someone keeping an appointment with God. Had sat in hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers, and eventually a long-term care facility where the walls were painted the particular shade of institutional blue that exists in every VA facility in America, a color that aspires to calm and achieves only sadness. He'd watched Raymond diminish, watched the body that had been strong enough to carry a rifle and a pack and the hopes of a country that sent him to war but couldn't decide how to care for him when the war was done. Watched the surgeries accumulate like chapters in a book that everyone knew how it ended, but no one wanted to finish reading. And now Raymond was gone, and the man in 22C was flying to Arlington to fold a flag and place it in the hands of Raymond's mother, and tell her that her son had been brave and had been loved and had been carried when he couldn't walk, and that the carrying would continue even after the casket was lowered and the earth was replaced and the headstone was set. This was the man who had been reported as a security threat. This was the man who had been verified 4 times, removed from an aircraft, physically seized in the aisle, detained in a jetway, and subjected to a criminal background check. This was the man who didn't belong. The aircraft reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign clicked off with its familiar chime. The cabin exhaled. Passengers shifted, stretched, opened laptops, pulled out headphones. The ordinary machinery of air travel reasserting itself. Pryor began the beverage service. She worked from front to back, first class first, as always, the hierarchy of comfort expressed through the order of refreshment. When she reached row 22, she paused. "Can I get you anything, sir?" The man looked up from the letter. "Water, please." She poured it from a can into a plastic cup, handed it to him. Their hands were close enough that she could see the scar on his left hand, a white line that ran from the base of the thumb to the wrist, disappearing under his sleeve. The kind of scar that comes from metal moving through flesh at speed. She didn't mention the scar, didn't mention the overhead bin, didn't mention any of what had happened. "Thank you," he said. She moved on. 40 minutes into the flight, at approximately 3:15 p.m., Neville walked back through the cabin. He'd been forward, reviewing the complaint file on his tablet, cross-referencing airline protocols, building the documentation that corporate security built for every flagged incident regardless of outcome. He paused at row 22, not to speak, but to observe. The man was sitting with the cup of water untouched on the tray table, the letter in his hands, the notebook in his jacket pocket, the calm unchanged. Neville looked at the man, looked at the overhead bin, looked at the man again. Then he walked to the aft galley and spoke to the senior flight attendant. The conversation was brief. Neville's face wore an expression that Vernon Pace, from 6 rows forward, recognized as the face of a man who had just realized he was on the wrong side of something. At 3:42 p.m., 20 minutes before landing, Pryor made her final pass through the cabin. She stopped at the overhead bin above row 22, opened it, reached inside, adjusted the duffel bag. The man in 22C watched. Pryor's hand moved to the spot where she had placed the electronics pouch 90 minutes earlier. Her fingers found it, closed around it, withdrew it. She slipped it into the pocket of her apron and closed the bin. "Just securing things for landing," she said. The professional smile again. The man opened his notebook. Wrote, 3:42 p.m., F.A. Pryor reopened bin 22. Retrieved item from vicinity of duffel exterior pocket. Item placed in apron pocket. No corresponding announcement or explanation. He looked at Pryor. She was already moving to the next row, but she felt his eyes. The particular weight of being watched by someone who understood exactly what he had just seen. She did not look back. The descent began at 3:48 p.m. The seatbelt sign returned. The cabin configured for landing. Tray tables up, seats forward, window shades open. The Potomac appeared in the window beside row 22, gray and wide and lined with monuments to the kinds of service that the country celebrated in marble, but sometimes forgot to honor in the daily encounters that comprised actual civilian life. The man looked out the window. Arlington was down there. The cemetery, the rows of white headstones, the green precision of maintained grief. Raymond was there, or would be after the ceremony, after the flag was folded, after the bugler played the notes that every veteran heard in dreams and silence and the spaces between heartbeats. He pressed his palm against the window. The glass was cold. The river below reflected the gray March sky. At 3:55 p.m., Flight 2274 touched down at Reagan National. The aircraft taxied to the gate. The seatbelt sign stayed on. The cabin buzzed with the restless energy of passengers eager to stand up and retrieve their bags and resume the forward motion that sitting still had interrupted. But the seatbelt sign did not turn off. The PA system clicked on. Not the automated voice. Not Pryor, the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Mercer. I'm going to ask you to remain seated for just a moment." Confusion. Passengers exchanged glances. A mechanical issue? A security hold? The remnants of the earlier delay? The cockpit door opened, and Captain Julian Mercer stepped out. This is the moment everything changes. If you're watching, hit the like button and stay until the end. You do not want to miss what happens next. He was in full uniform, captain's hat, wings, the 4 stripes on each sleeve that represented 34 years and 1,200 carrier landings, and a career that had taken him from the deck of an aircraft carrier to the cockpit of a commercial airliner. He was not a large man, 5'10", lean, with the economical build of a fighter pilot, but he filled the aisle with something that had nothing to do with physical size. He walked out of the cockpit, past the first-class galley, past Pryor, who pressed herself against the bulkhead to let him pass, past the first-class cabin, where Margot Linden looked up from her phone with an expression that started as expectation and rapidly became something else. He walked into the main cabin, past row 6, where Vernon Pace sat forward in his seat, past row 14, past row 19, row 20, row 21. He stopped at row 22. The man in the window seat looked up at Captain Julian Mercer. Mercer looked down at the man in the worn field jacket with the canvas duffel bag, and the folded letter and the notebook full of dates and times, and the evidence of an afternoon that should never have happened. Mercer removed his captain's hat, held it against his chest with his left hand, drew his shoulders back, lifted his chin, and rendered a full, precise military salute. The cabin stopped breathing. The salute held for 3 seconds. The particular salute of one service member to another, not the casual touch the brim of social acknowledgement, but the real thing, the hand at the exact angle, the fingers together, the elbow squared, the posture communicating respect in a language older than the airline, older than the airport, older than the petty hierarchies of first class and coach and who belongs and who doesn't. The man in 22C stood. The motion was the same as before, fluid, economical, one state to the next without transition. He faced Mercer and returned the salute. 2 men, 2 services. 2 salutes exchanged in an aluminum tube at a gate in Reagan National, while 146 passengers watched something they didn't fully understand but could feel in the sudden tightness of their chests and the unexpected heat behind their eyes. "Colonel Kane," Mercer said. His voice carried without effort through the silent cabin. "It's an honor to have you aboard, sir." "Colonel." The word landed in the cabin like a detonation. Quiet, devastating, rearranging everything. The man in the worn jacket and re-soled boots. The man who'd been verified 4 times, removed, seized, detained, and background checked. The man who a woman in first class had reported as a security threat because he looked wrong to her. The man who had said nothing about himself through 2 hours of escalating institutional hostility. Colonel. Mercer turned to face the cabin. Not to the PA. His own voice, speaking to people who could see his face and the face of the man standing beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know who is sitting in row 22. Margot Linden's hand froze over her phone. Kirk Neville's tablet went dark against his leg. Pryor stood in the galley with the electronics pouch still in her apron pocket, her face the color of the cabin walls. Colonel Desmond Kane, United States Army Special Forces, retired, Silver Star, Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, 3 combat deployments, credited with saving 17 lives during Operation Phantom Fury in Fallujah. Mercer paused. The silence in the cabin was absolute. "He is traveling today to bury one of the soldiers he carried out." The first officer's voice came over the PA system. Amara Solis, reading from a document she had retrieved from the DoD coordination file. The document that had changed the temperature of the cockpit, the document that was about to change the temperature of the entire aircraft. Department of Defense Distinguished Service Citation, dated November 12, 2009. Quote, Colonel Desmond A. Kane, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy. Colonel Kane, while wounded in both legs by improvised explosive device fragmentation, carried 3 incapacitated service members across 400 meters of hostile terrain under sustained enemy fire, directly saving their lives and enabling the evacuation of 14 additional personnel. His actions reflect great credit upon himself, the United States Army, and the Department of Defense. End quote. The words settled over the cabin like snow. 400 meters. Wounded in both legs. 3 men carried. 14 more evacuated. Sustained enemy fire. And a woman in 3A had called him a security threat because he wore an old jacket and sat quietly in coach. Vernon Pace, in row 6, pulled out his phone. Deleted the unsent text. Typed a new one. Disregard last message. I know exactly who he is. Colonel Desmond Kane. I was at Walter Reed when they brought him in after Fallujah. He had shrapnel in both legs, and he was asking about his men before he would let them sedate him. He sent this one. In row 14, the woman who had moved from row 21, the woman who had allowed Margot Linden's whispered concern to reorganize her seating choice, pressed her hand over her mouth. Her husband stared at the tray table in front of him with the fixed concentration of a man who could not look up, because looking up meant looking at what he'd been part of. In row 23B, the woman with the phone, the one whose angle might have been recording, was definitely recording now, and crying, simultaneously. In the galley, Pryor's hand moved to her apron pocket, touched the electronics pouch, the pouch she had placed on a decorated colonel's duffel bag as manufactured evidence that he was a thief. The pouch she had retrieved 30 minutes ago when something shifted in the crew's disposition and her insurance policy became a liability. Her hand stayed in her pocket. Her face stayed the color of the walls. And in seat 3A, Margot Linden sat perfectly still. Her phone was in her lap. Her diamond loyalty tag swung gently from the luggage handle in the overhead bin. Her complaint was in the airline system. Her voice was on the premium member hotline recording. Her words, suspicious individual, behaving erratically, casing the gate, were documented, time-stamped, attributed. She had reported a Silver Star recipient as a security threat. She had orchestrated his social isolation. She had lobbied for his removal from an aircraft. She had enlisted other passengers in a campaign of exclusion that had resulted in police intervention, physical contact, and the involuntary removal of a man whose service record was longer than her loyalty membership. The cabin was staring at her now. Not all of it, but enough. The passengers near row 22 who had watched the removal and the return and the salute. The passengers who had been briefed by her whispered campaign and who now understood what they had been recruited into. The passengers who had moved seats, who had looked away, who had participated through silence in the machinery of suspicion that had ground against a man who deserved the opposite of everything he'd received. Margot did not look up. She studied her phone with the fierce attention of someone building a wall between herself and the world, with the only materials available, a glass screen and the pretense of distraction. Captain Mercer turned back to the man in row 22. The colonel. "Sir, on behalf of this crew and this airline, I apologize for what happened today. It was wrong. And I'm sorry." The colonel looked at Mercer. His expression had not changed. Not during the salute, not during the citation, not during the apology. The same steady, measured face he'd worn through every verification, every demand, every escalation. The face of a man who had learned that expressions were currency, and spending them carelessly was a luxury he had never been able to afford. "Thank you, Captain," he said. "Quiet." "I'm just trying to get to Arlington." Mercer nodded, put his hat back on, turned and walked back to the cockpit. The door closed behind him. The seatbelt sign clicked off. The cabin remained seated for 3 more seconds. Then the ordinary machinery of arrival resumed. Seatbelts unbuckling, overhead bins opening, passengers standing in the compressed choreography of deplaning. But the sound was different, quieter. The usual impatience replaced by something more careful, more aware, as if the air itself had been recalibrated by what had just happened. The colonel stood, retrieved his duffel, stepped into the aisle, and one by one, as he walked toward the front of the aircraft, passengers began to do something that none of them had planned, and none of them would have predicted 30 minutes earlier. They stood. Not all of them, but enough. Vernon Pace stood first, in row 6, drawing himself to his full height with the stiffness of a 72-year-old body and the precision of a man who'd spent 30 years serving people who deserved to be stood for. Behind him, the woman in 7C stood, then the man in 8A, then a teenager in 9B who didn't fully understand what was happening, but understood that standing was the right thing to do, because the adults around him were doing it with their eyes full of something he'd never seen in an airplane before. The colonel walked through a corridor of standing passengers. He did not acknowledge them individually. He did not nod or wave or smile. He walked with the same steady, unhurried gait, the gait of a man who had walked through corridors of fire and survived, and was now walking through a corridor of something softer that he did not quite know how to receive. He passed row 3. Margot Linden remained seated. Her eyes remained on her phone. She was the only person in the first 6 rows who did not stand. The colonel did not look at her, did not slow, did not give her the satisfaction of a glance that would confirm she mattered enough to anger or disappoint. He stepped off the aircraft and into the jetway. And there, standing at the gate entrance, was Sergeant Boyd Orbach, badge 3344, the man who had removed him, who had seized his arm, who had detained him, who had run his name through a criminal database. Orbach was standing at attention, not the rigid attention of a subordinate awaiting orders, but the particular careful attention of a man who had just learned something about the person he'd manhandled and was trying to find the appropriate response in a manual that didn't have a chapter for this. The colonel stopped, looked at Orbach. Orbach looked back. "Sergeant?" "Colonel." They stood there for 3 seconds. Then the colonel adjusted the duffel on his shoulder and walked past, through the gate, into the terminal, toward the exit, toward Arlington, toward the ceremony, toward the cemetery, toward the rows of white headstones where Raymond was waiting to be carried one last time. Behind him, Orbach watched him go. His hand moved to his radio, then stopped, dropped to his side. He stood in the gate entrance and watched the man in the faded field jacket disappear into the terminal crowd, a figure moving through civilian space with the bearing of someone who had earned the right to move through any space on Earth and who was tired, deeply and permanently tired, of being asked to prove it. The jetway was empty now. The aircraft was emptying. The crew was performing post-flight checks. Pryor was in the aft galley, removing the electronics pouch from her apron and placing it back in the airline's onboard inventory drawer, her hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with turbulence. And in the cockpit, Captain Mercer sat in his seat and stared at the instrument panel and thought about the investigation, the administrative review, the documentation process that would consume the next 6 weeks and produce findings that some people would call justice and others would call insufficient, and most would eventually forget. But that was the future. Right now, in the present, a colonel was walking through Reagan National Airport toward the taxi stand, carrying a duffel bag and a letter and a notebook full of evidence and the shrapnel in his shoulder that no scanner had ever flagged. And somewhere in the terminal behind him, the system that had failed him was beginning the slow, reluctant process of examining itself. The process would be incomplete. The outcomes would be partial. The change would be uncertain. But the documentation existed. The witnesses existed. The salute had been seen by 146 passengers and would be described, in the coming days, in social media posts and news interviews, and the quiet conversations that happened between strangers who shared a plane and saw something they couldn't forget. And in an overhead bin on an aircraft at Gate C-17, a canvas duffel bag was gone, and the space where it had been was empty, and the electronics pouch was back in the inventory drawer, and the overhead bin log showed 2 entries by F.A. Pryor, J., one at 2:41 p.m. and one at 3:42 p.m., and the gap between those entries contained everything that was wrong, and everything that was possible, and everything that remained, as always, unresolved. The colonel stepped into a taxi, gave the driver the address of the cemetery, sat in the back seat with the duffel at his feet and the letter in his hands, and the window showing him a city that built monuments to service, while its airports treated service members like suspects. The taxi pulled away from the curb. The airport shrank in the rear window. Tomorrow would bring phone calls, investigations, the machinery of accountability grinding into motion with the reluctant speed of institutions confronting their own failures. Lawyers and administrators and union representatives and public affairs officers assembling their positions like armies before a battle that would be fought with memos and policies and carefully worded statements that acknowledged harm without admitting fault. But today was for Raymond. Today was for the letter and the flag and the cemetery and the weight of carrying someone who couldn't be carried anymore except in memory and in the stubborn, breaking, inexhaustible refusal to let them be forgotten. The taxi crossed the Potomac. Arlington waited on the other side, and in the colonel's jacket pocket, next to the letter and the notebook and the case reference number that Sergeant Orbach had written on a torn piece of paper, a phone buzzed once. A voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. He would listen to it later. After the funeral. After the folded flag. After the bugle and the rifle salute and the 21 seconds of silence that followed. He would listen to it later and hear a voice that would reopen everything he thought was closing. But that was later. That was part 2. Right now the taxi was crossing the river and the cemetery was ahead, and the letter was in his hands, and the promise was being kept. One more carry, one last time. The cemetery at Arlington held its silence the way cathedrals hold candlelight, not as absence, but as presence, something alive and insistent, shaped by the weight of what it contained. March 17th, 9:14 a.m., Section 60. The section reserved for casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan, where headstones stood in rows so precise they seemed to vibrate with the attention of someone who cared about alignment the way surgeons care about incisions. Each stone identical. White marble, rounded top, name and rank and dates, and the particular abbreviation of a life reduced to the minimum information a government needs to honor it. Desmond Kane stood at the edge of a freshly cut rectangle of earth. The duffel bag was at his feet. The field jacket was buttoned to the collar against a March wind that came off the Potomac with a cold that felt personal, as though the river knew what was happening here and had decided to participate. Around him, a small group. Raymond Okafor's mother, Aduni, 61, in a black coat that was too thin for the weather, hands folded in front of her, standing with the absolute stillness of a woman who had been preparing for this morning for 17 years and still was not ready. Raymond's sister, Kioma, 28, who had been 11 when her brother deployed and had grown up in the shadow of his absence and the partial presence of his long recovery. 2 cousins. A former platoon sergeant named Dominic Rourke, who had driven 8 hours from Tennessee and stood slightly apart from the family, occupying the space that soldiers occupy at soldier funerals, close enough to grieve, separate enough to maintain the composure that the uniform demanded, even when the uniform was no longer being worn. And Desmond, who had carried Raymond through fire and was about to watch him lowered into earth. The honor guard was 7 soldiers in dress blues. They moved with a precision that made their bodies look mechanical, each motion calibrated to a standard that transcended individual performance. The flag was folded 13 times, each fold exact, each tuck clean, the final triangle revealing only the blue field and white stars. The bugler played taps. 24 notes. Each one hung in the cold air for a fraction of a second longer than seemed possible, the way sound behaves in places where grief has accumulated over decades and soaked into the ground like rain. The rifle salute cracked across the section. 3 volleys, 7 rifles, 21 reports that echoed off headstones and scattered a flock of starlings from a nearby oak. The birds wheeled in the gray sky and resettled. The silence returned. The flag was presented to Aduni. The soldier who placed it in her hands spoke the words that have been spoken at Arlington thousands of times, words about a grateful nation and faithful service. And Aduni received the flag the way she had received every piece of her son for 17 years, with hands that trembled but did not drop what they held. Desmond waited until the honor guard departed, waited until the cousins walked Aduni to the car, waited until Kioma lingered, placed a hand on the casket, whispered something no one else heard, and followed. Waited until Dominic Rourke shook his hand, a grip that communicated more than any sentence could, and walked to his truck in the parking area with the stiff gait of a man whose knees had been damaged by the same war that had damaged Raymond. Then Desmond was alone. He pulled the letter from his jacket pocket, unfolded it for the last time. The handwriting was his own, written 3 days ago at the kitchen table in Fayetteville, written and rewritten until the words were right, though he knew no words were right for this. He read it once more, then placed it on the casket. The wind caught the edge and tried to take it, but the paper was heavy enough, or the words were heavy enough, to hold. "I carried you through Fallujah," he said. Not to anyone, to the air, to the marble, to the ground that was about to receive what was left of a promise kept across 17 years and 400 meters, and the entire distance between the living and the dead. "I carried you through Walter Reed, through every surgery, through every setback, through every time they told your mother it was over and it wasn't." He paused. The wind moved the letter half an inch across the casket's surface. "I'll carry you here too, Ray. One more time." He stood there for 11 minutes. He knew the time because he checked his watch when he arrived at the grave and checked it when he left, the habit of a man who documented everything, even grief. The wind shifted, brought the smell of cut grass and turned earth, and something underneath both, the mineral scent of Virginia clay, the particular soil that held the remains of every conflict America had fought since the Civil War. Desmond had buried friends before, not many. He'd been careful, the way leaders learn to be careful, managing risk and exposure, and the terrible arithmetic of who goes first and who provides cover and who carries the stretcher when the stretcher bearer falls. But enough that the choreography of military funerals existed in his body as muscle memory. He knew when to stand, when to salute, when to hold his breath so the sound of breathing wouldn't intrude on the silence. He knew how to grieve with his spine straight and his hands at his sides and his eyes open, because closing them was a luxury that dignity did not allow. The military taught you to grieve while standing at attention. The military taught you a lot of things about how to suffer without showing it, and most of those lessons were useful, and all of them left scars that civilians couldn't see and institutions didn't count. Raymond had taught him something different. Raymond had taught him that you could laugh in a hospital bed with tubes in your arms and a prognosis that read like a countdown, that you could tell jokes to nurses while learning to use a wheelchair, that you could lose function in your legs and gain a perspective that made the loss bearable. Not acceptable, never acceptable, but bearable in the way that soldiers make unbearable things bearable, by refusing to acknowledge that they aren't. 17 years of visits. 17 years of driving to Walter Reed and sitting in chairs designed for shorter conversations and watching Raymond navigate the slow narrowing of possibilities that combat injuries imposed on a body that had once been capable of anything. 9 surgeries, each one buying time that the next complication would eventually claim. The infections that came and went like weather. The phantom pain in limbs that still functioned but had been damaged in ways that medical imaging could show but medical science couldn't fully repair. Raymond had never complained, not once, not about the pain, not about the VA paperwork that lost his benefits 3 times, not about the apartment in Fayetteville that the VA housing coordinator had approved and then unapproved and then reapproved across 11 months of bureaucratic recalculation. He'd taken what the system gave him and supplemented the gaps with humor and stubbornness and the particular resilience of a man who had survived Fallujah and refused to be defeated by paperwork. The last conversation had been by phone. Raymond's voice, thinner than it used to be, but still carrying the cadence of a man from Lagos who'd learned English in North Carolina and spoke it with both accents simultaneously. "Colonel, stop driving up here every month. You're burning gas money you don't have." "I have plenty of gas money, Ray." "You drive a Honda Civic from 2009. You don't have plenty of anything." They'd laughed. The laugh that men share when the truth is too heavy for anything except humor. The laugh that covers the sound of something breaking underneath. 3 days later, Raymond's sister called. Desmond was at the kitchen table. He knew before answering. You always know. The call that comes at the wrong hour, from the number you recognize but don't want to see, you always know. He'd driven to Walter Reed that night, 5.5 hours, arrived at 3 a.m., sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes because the transition from the car to the building required crossing a threshold he wasn't ready to cross. Then he'd crossed it. Because readiness was a luxury, and Desmond Kane had spent his life doing necessary things before he was ready. Now Raymond was in the ground, and the letter was on the casket, and the wind was still trying to take it, and the words were still holding. Then he picked up the duffel bag, settled it on the shoulder with the shrapnel, and walked out of Section 60 toward the parking area where no taxi waited because he hadn't called one yet. He sat on a bench near the visitors center and pulled out his phone. One missed call. The voicemail from the number he didn't recognize. He pressed play. The voice was female, young, hesitant in the way that comes from fear rather than uncertainty, the sound of someone who knew exactly what they wanted to say but was afraid of what saying it would cost them. "Colonel Kane, my name is Jeanette Pryor. I was the flight attendant on your flight yesterday. Flight 2274. I need to talk to you. Not through lawyers, not through the airline. I need to tell you what I was asked to do and who asked me to do it. Please call me back. This number is my personal cell." He played it again, then a third time. The words didn't change, but each repetition revealed a layer that the previous one had missed, the breath before "what I was asked to do," which carried the particular weight of a confession being rehearsed. The pause before "who asked me," which suggested the answer involved someone with enough power that naming them required courage. He saved the voicemail, did not return the call, not yet. There was a sequence to these things, a order of operations that he'd learned across decades of navigating situations where information was currency and timing determined its value. You didn't spend currency before you understood the market. Instead, he called the number on the torn piece of paper that Sergeant Orbach had given him in the jetway. The airport police administrative line. An automated system answered, offered a directory, and routed him to records. I'm requesting the incident report for case reference number RDU-AP-2026-0316-047. My name is Desmond Kane. I was the subject of the encounter. The records clerk took his information, confirmed the case reference existed, informed him the report would be available within 72 hours and could be retrieved in person or by mail. He hung up, called a second number, one he'd memorized years ago, the way he memorized anything that might matter later. Law Office of Patricia Caldwell. This is Desmond Kane. I need to speak with Patricia about a civil rights matter involving an airline and airport police. Yesterday, Raleigh-Durham International. A pause, the sound of typing. Ms. Caldwell can see you Thursday at 10 a.m. Can you describe the general nature of the issue? Racial profiling during boarding. Unsubstantiated passenger complaint. 4 identity verifications. Involuntary removal from aircraft. Unauthorized physical contact by airport police during compliant exit. Detention and criminal background check in the jetway. Another pause. Longer. The typing stopped. Mr. Kane, Ms. Caldwell can see you tomorrow at 8 a.m. Would that work? That works. He ended the call, sat on the bench. The cemetery stretched around him in every direction, white stone and green grass and the controlled geometry of national memory. He'd sat on benches like this before, after every visit to Raymond at Walter Reed, after every surgery, every complication, every conversation with doctors who delivered bad news with the clinical compassion of people who delivered bad news for a living. He'd sat and processed and calculated and decided what to do next. He decided what to do next. He pulled up the voicemail from Jeanette Pryor and listened to it a 4th time. Then he opened his phone's browser and searched for the airline's internal complaint system, the public-facing version, the one passengers used. He filed a formal complaint, typed it in the same precise, economical language he used in the notebook. Names, badge numbers, times, sequence of events, specific policies violated, statutes implicated. He did not mention his rank, did not mention the Silver Star, did not mention the salute. The complaint described what happened to a passenger, not what happened to a colonel, because the entire point, was that what happened should not have happened to any passenger, regardless of what was in their service record or their jacket pocket or their overhead bin. If this story is making you think, subscribe, and stay until the very end, the truth cuts deeper than you expect. 3 days later, on March 19th, the airline's Internal Affairs Division opened case number AIR-YA-2026-00417. The case file, which would eventually grow to 412 pages, began with a summary paragraph written by an investigator named Grace Hebert, who had been with the airline's Employee Relations Division for 9 years and had reviewed approximately 600 passenger complaints during that time. She had never reviewed one quite like this. The summary read, on March 16, 2026, passenger Kane, Desmond A., traveling on Flight 2274 RDU-DCA, was subjected to multiple identity verifications, removal from the aircraft, physical contact by airport police, and detention in the jetway. The initiating complaint, filed by premium passenger Lyndon, Margot A., Seat 3A, cited no specific behavioral basis for the security concern. Subjects under review include Holloway, Trent, gate supervisor, Pryor, Jeanette, flight attendant, Neville, Kirk, corporate security liaison. Preliminary assessment indicates the complaint handling deviated from standard protocols at multiple points. Grace Hebert's first action was to pull the gate audio, not the passenger-facing announcements, the internal radio traffic between Holloway's podium and ground operations. The recording was time-stamped, and the relevant transmission took 11 seconds. Zone 4 passenger, seat 22C, flagging for secondary. No system alert, passenger concern only. Requesting guidance. She played it 4 times. The phrase "no system alert" was the key. Holloway had flagged a passenger for secondary verification without any system-generated alert. No TSA flag, no watch list match, no behavioral detection indicator. The flag was based entirely on a complaint from another passenger. Airline protocol permitted secondary verification under those circumstances, but the protocol also required a documented behavioral basis from the complaining passenger. Holloway's flag cited none. His field notes, retrieved from the gate computer system, contained one line: PAX concern, 3A, Re 2, 2C. Appearance. Appearance. Hebert underlined the word. In the margin of her working notes, she wrote, "Define, follow up." What specific aspect of appearance triggered the concern? Was the passenger asked? The answer, when Holloway was interviewed 6 days later in a conference room at the airline's RDU base, was instructive. She said he didn't look like he belonged, Holloway said. His union representative sat beside him, a man named Fisk, who took notes on a yellow legal pad and intervened whenever the questions approached territory that could generate disciplinary action. "Did you ask her to define that?" Hebert asked. "No." "Did you observe any specific behavior from the passenger that corroborated her concern?" "He was—" Holloway paused, looked at Fisk. Fisk nodded slightly. "He was looking around a lot." "Looking around? At an airport gate, while waiting to board a flight?" "It seemed attentive. More attentive than usual." Hebert made a note. "Did you document attentive in your field notes?" "No." "Your field notes say appearance. That's the only basis cited. Is that accurate?" Fisk leaned forward. "My client flagged the passenger in response to a premium member's concern. He followed the escalation protocol as he understood it. The escalation protocol requires a documented behavioral basis. Appearance is not a behavior." The interview lasted 47 minutes. At no point did Holloway identify a specific action, statement, or behavioral indicator that justified the flag. The entire chain of events, the secondary verification, the jetway confrontation, Neville's interview, the police return to gate, had been initiated by a complaint that described a man's presence rather than his conduct. Pryor's interview was scheduled for March 28th. She didn't show. Her union representative called Hebert at 8:12 a.m. and said Pryor was invoking her right to postpone under the collective bargaining agreement's investigation procedures. The postponement was valid for 14 calendar days. But Pryor had already made a phone call that was more consequential than any interview. On the evening of March 17th, the day after the flight, the day Desmond Kane stood at Raymond Okafor's grave, Pryor had sat in her apartment in Durham and stared at her phone for 40 minutes before dialing. She'd called Desmond Kane's number, reached voicemail, and left the message he would play 4 times on a bench at Arlington. What she had not done, what she spent the next 11 days debating, was decide whether to tell the airline's investigators the same thing she'd offered to tell Kane. The thing about the electronics pouch. The pouch had been her idea in execution, but not in origin. The origin was a conversation with Kirk Neville at 2:45 p.m. on March 16th in the first-class galley, while the aircraft was still at the gate, and the complaint against the man in 22C was escalating through the system. Neville had said, and Pryor would later struggle to recall whether the words were directive or suggestive, whether they constituted an instruction or a thought experiment, something to the effect of, "It would simplify things if there were a tangible reason to remove him." A tangible reason. Not a feeling. Not an appearance. Not the atmospheric unease of a woman in first class. A thing. Something that could be documented. Something that could be cited in the paperwork that justified removal. something that transformed a complaint about presence into a complaint about conduct. Pryor had understood, had walked through the cabin with the electronics pouch, airline property, easily traceable, theoretically attributable to any passenger, and had placed it on the duffel bag in the overhead bin above 22C. Had intended to discover it later and create the tangible reason that Neville had identified as missing. She had retrieved it before using it, had made that choice during the descent when the crew's disposition toward the passenger shifted and the risk calculus changed, had slipped it back into inventory and convinced herself that because the plan was never executed, no harm had been done. But the overhead bin log existed. 2 entries by Pryor, J, one at 2:41 p.m. and one at 3:42 p.m., with no corresponding passenger request. The log was not evidence of a planted pouch. It was evidence of 2 unexplained bin interactions that, in the context of everything else, invited questions that Pryor did not want to answer. And now she'd left a voicemail for the man she'd targeted, offering to tell him what she'd been asked to do. The voicemail was its own kind of evidence, of conscience, of fear, of the particular desperation that arises when a person realizes that the system they served has made them complicit in something they cannot quietly undo. On March 20th, 3 days after the funeral, Desmond Kane sat in Patricia Caldwell's office in downtown Raleigh. Caldwell was 53, a former federal prosecutor who'd transitioned to civil rights litigation 12 years ago and had built a practice that specialized in exactly the kind of case now sitting across her desk. She'd reviewed Kane's notebook, the case reference number, and the voicemail from Pryor. "The voicemail is significant," she said. "A crew member reaching out independently to describe being directed to manufacture evidence. That's not just a complaint response issue. That implicates the airline's security liaison in potential evidence fabrication." She said she was asked to do something. She didn't say what. "Which is why we need her to talk. But not yet." Caldwell opened a folder. "First, we document the chain. Your notes are excellent. Timestamps, names, badge numbers. We'll supplement with the airport police report, which you've already requested. We'll FOIA the gate radio transmission through the airline's public records obligations. And we'll file a formal civil rights complaint." "Where?" 2 tracks. Federal, TSA Office of Investigations, referencing 49 U.S.C., Section 46, 1507, filing a materially false or misleading report regarding a threat aboard an aircraft. That's Margot Linden. Separately, we file with DOT under Title VI, Racial Discrimination in Commercial Air Transportation. And the police? Airport police are a separate jurisdiction. We file an internal affairs complaint against Sergeant Orbach, unauthorized physical contact during a compliant encounter, failure to provide badge number and incident report number upon request. Their department policy 4.7.2 requires identification during any enforcement action. He didn't comply until after the encounter concluded. Kane nodded. He was familiar with the architecture of institutional complaint systems. The forms, the timelines, the deliberate slowness that wasn't malice, but wasn't efficiency either. It was the velocity of institutions protecting themselves while appearing to investigate themselves, and it moved at exactly the speed required to exhaust anyone who didn't have the resources and patience to endure it. He had both. "One more thing," Caldwell said. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward him. A social media post. Someone's phone video, shaky, shot from approximately row 23. The video showed Captain Mercer walking down the aisle, stopping at row 22, removing his hat, rendering the salute. The audio was cabin noise, and the distant sound of Mercer's voice, not all of it intelligible, but the words Colonel and Silver Star and 17 lives were clear enough. The post had been shared 42,000 times in 3 days. "This is going to be public," Caldwell said. "Your choice whether to engage with that or let the video speak for itself." "Let it speak." "Understood. But the airline knows it's public too. which means their investigation is now happening under public scrutiny. That changes the calculus. It changed the calculus the way gravity changes a ball's trajectory, invisibly, inevitably, bending every subsequent decision toward the ground truth that the airline had mishandled a passenger who turned out to be a decorated war hero, and that the mishandling had been captured on video and was now circulating through the exact channels that airlines fear most, the ones they cannot control. 4 days later, on March 24th, two things happened simultaneously. The TSA Office of Investigations acknowledged receipt of Caldwell's referral regarding Margot Linden. The acknowledgement was a form letter. 1 paragraph, case number assigned, estimated review period of 60 to 90 days. It committed to nothing except the fact that a file now existed with Margot's name on it. And the airport police department at RDU issued a press statement in response to media inquiries generated by the viral video. The RDU Airport Police Department is aware of an incident involving a passenger on March 16, 2026. An internal review is underway. Sergeant Boyd Orbach has been placed on administrative desk duty pending the outcome of the review. We are committed to ensuring that all interactions between our officers and the traveling public are conducted professionally and in accordance with department policy and federal law. Administrative desk duty, not suspension, not leave. Desk duty, the institutional equivalent of moving a chess piece to a less visible square without removing it from the board. Orbach's union issued its own statement 12 minutes after the department's. Sergeant Orbach responded to an airline-initiated request for police assistance. He followed standard procedures for passenger removal. The union is confident that the review will confirm Sergeant Orbach acted within policy. The gap between those two statements, between the department's careful neutrality and the union's assertive defense, was the space where investigations lived and died. Hebert, the airline investigator, recognized this gap. She'd seen it before, in other cases, other cities, other institutions. The gap was where accountability went to be negotiated, where sharp edges were sanded smooth, where outcomes were determined not by what happened, but by what could be proved and what proving it would cost. On April 1st, 2 weeks after the flight, Patricia Caldwell received a call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail. The message was from Jeanette Pryor. Ms. Caldwell, my name is Jeanette Pryor. I was a flight attendant on Flight 2274 on March 16th. I left a voicemail for Colonel Kane. He may have shared it with you. I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, and I've decided I need to talk to someone. I have information about what happened on that flight that the airline's investigators don't know yet. It involves their corporate security liaison. I'd rather speak with you than with the airline's internal team because I don't trust the internal team to protect me. Please call me back. Caldwell called her back within the hour. The conversation lasted 53 minutes. Caldwell took notes in the particular shorthand that trial lawyers develop, abbreviations and arrows and circled phrases that mapped the structure of a witness statement while it was being given. Pryor described Neville's galley conversation, the phrase, tangible reason, the electronics pouch, the placement on the duffel bag, the retrieval during descent, the overhead bin log entries. Pryor also described something Caldwell hadn't expected. A pattern. This was not, Pryor said, the first time Neville had suggested manufactured justification for passenger removal. 3 months earlier, on a flight from Charlotte to Boston, Neville had instructed a flight attendant to document a passenger's erratic behavior when the passenger had done nothing except recline his seat during boarding and refused to put it upright until asked twice. The passenger was black. The complaint was from a white first-class passenger. The documentation supported a gate hold at Boston that delayed the passenger 45 minutes while police verified his identity. "Do you have records of that?" Caldwell asked. "I have texts. Between me and the flight attendant on the Boston flight. She told me about it afterward. She was upset." "Are you willing to share those texts?" A long pause, the kind of pause that contains a career decision. "Yes." On April 3rd, Caldwell forwarded a supplemental filing to the airline's Internal Affairs Division and simultaneously to the DOT's Office of Civil Rights. The filing included a sworn declaration from Jeanette Pryor describing the electronics pouch incident, Neville's role, and the Boston precedent. It included screenshots of text messages between Pryor and the Boston flight attendant. It included a request that the airline's investigation expand its scope from a single incident to a pattern or practice inquiry focused on Neville's conduct across multiple flights. The filing landed on Grace Haybert's desk at 9:30 a.m. on April 4th. She read it twice. Then she closed her office door, pulled up the airline's employee database, and searched Kirk Neville's name. His file showed 14 years with the airline, 12 in corporate security. 3 passenger complaint reviews in which he'd been the responding security liaison. All 3 had been closed without findings. All 3 passengers had been black. Haber opened a new case file, linked it to AIR-IA-2026-00417. Began typing a memorandum to the Vice President of Employee Relations, recommending the investigation be elevated from a standard complaint review to a pattern assessment. This is where the system starts to crack. Keep watching. The receipts are about to pile up. On April 14th, Vernon Pace sat in his living room in Durham and wrote a letter. Vernon was 72. He'd retired from the VA system 4 years ago after 30 years that had begun at Walter Reed and ended at the Durham 5A Medical Center. In between, he'd cared for thousands of veterans, cleaned wounds, administered medications, held hands during nightmares, sat with families while doctors delivered news that would reshape their lives. He'd been good at the work, not because of technical skill, though his skills were considerable, but because he understood that caring for veterans was not a medical function but a moral one. It was the last link in a chain that began with a nation asking young people to die for it, and was supposed to end with that same nation ensuring they were honored and protected when they came home. The chain broke constantly. Vernon had spent 30 years welding the broken links back together, one patient at a time, one shift at a time, knowing that the repairs were temporary and the breaks were structural. He'd recognized Desmond Kane on the flight. Not the face, but the type. The bearing, the walk, the hands. The way the man sat in his seat with his back straight and his hands on the armrests, and his eyes tracking movement with the unconscious vigilance of someone whose nervous system had been permanently calibrated by combat. Vernon had seen that posture 10,000 times, in hospital beds, in wheelchairs, in the waiting rooms where veterans sat with expressions that civilians misread as anger or hostility, but were actually hypervigilance, the body's alarm system, still running at full volume years after the threat had passed. He'd watched the entire encounter on the flight, the verifications, the removal, the jetway, the return, the salute. He'd watched it with the particular fury of a man who dedicated his life to caring for people like Desmond Kane, and who now watched one of them be treated like a criminal in real time, 3 feet from his seat, by people who couldn't see past the jacket and the boots and the color of his skin to the service record and the sacrifice beneath. The letter was addressed to the airline's chief executive officer. Copy to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Copy to the ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. Vernon typed it on his computer, printed it, signed it by hand, and would mail it the next morning. The letter was 3 pages. Most of it was specific: dates, times, descriptions of what he'd witnessed. But one paragraph would later be excerpted in a news article about the incident, and it was the paragraph that people remembered. I spent 30 years caring for men and women who gave their bodies to this country. I dressed wounds that would make civilians faint. I held the hands of soldiers while they died. I watched families receive flags. I know what sacrifice looks like because I spent my career cleaning up after it. And on March 16th, I watched one of those men, a man I recognized as a veteran before I knew his name or rank, be treated like a criminal on your aircraft, removed from his seat, physically seized by police, detained and searched, because a woman in first class decided his presence made her uncomfortable. That is not a security protocol. That is not passenger safety. That is the specific, documentable, legally actionable failure of your airline to protect a customer's civil rights, and it is something I will not forget, and something your company should not be permitted to repeat. Vernon sealed the envelope, placed it on the hall table next to his keys, went to bed. Slept poorly, the way he always slept when the anger was fresh, the particular insomnia of a man who had spent decades channeling outrage into professional competence and who now, in retirement, had no channel for it except words on paper and the hope that words still mattered. The letter arrived at the airline's corporate headquarters on April 18th. It was logged, scanned, and forwarded to the legal department, the public affairs department, and Grace Heber's investigation file. The copy to the VA Secretary's office arrived 2 days later and was acknowledged with a form letter. The copy to the Senate committee arrived the same day and was read by a legislative aide who flagged it for the committee chair's weekly briefing. The institutional response to Vernon's letter was exactly what institutional responses to individual letters always are: acknowledgement, routing, filing. But the letter's effect was cumulative rather than immediate. It added mass to a file that was growing heavier every week, and institutional files have a tipping point, a weight beyond which they can no longer be managed through standard procedures and must be escalated to decision-makers who would rather not be involved but no longer have the option of ignorance. AIR-I A-2 026-00417 reached that tipping point on April 28th, 6 weeks after the flight, when Grace Heber submitted her preliminary findings to the airline's Employee Review Board and recommended formal disciplinary proceedings against 3 employees. The hearing was scheduled for May 2nd, conference room on the 4th floor of the airline's RDU Operations Center, 3-member panel, 2 from HR, 1 from legal. The subjects, their union representatives, and the airline's internal counsel arranged on opposite sides of a table that was slightly too large for the room, giving the proceedings the compressed intensity of a trial conducted in a space designed for something smaller. Holloway went first. He sat in a chair that was slightly lower than the panels, not by design, but the effect was the same. His union representative, Fisk, had prepared a defense built on procedural compliance. Holloway had received a passenger concern, flagged it through established channels, and received guidance from operations to proceed with standard boarding. The flag was precautionary. The system worked as designed. The panel's questions were precise. Heber had briefed them well. Mr. Holloway, your field notes for the flag on passenger Kane read, quote, PAX concern, 3A, RE, 22C, appearance, end quote. Can you explain what appearance refers to? Fisk started to respond. The panel chair, a woman named Denise Sutton, 18 years in HR, wire-rimmed glasses, the particular demeanor of someone who had conducted enough of these hearings to have no patience for evasion, raised a hand. I'm asking Mr. Holloway. Holloway shifted in the low chair. The complaining passenger described the individual's appearance as inconsistent with the travel environment. Inconsistent how? She said he looked out of place. Out of place. Based on what criteria? Silence. Holloway looked at Fisk. Fisk looked at his legal pad. The answer was in the room, occupying space like humidity, present, uncomfortable, impossible to address directly, without acknowledging what everyone already knew. She didn't specify criteria, Holloway said finally. And you didn't ask. No. And your protocol, Section 3, Paragraph 4 of the Gate Operations Manual, requires a documented behavioral indicator before initiating a passenger flag. You are aware of that requirement? Yes. And you flagged this passenger without one. Fisk intervened. My client followed the de facto practice that has been in place at this station for years. Premium passenger concerns are treated with heightened responsiveness. This is consistent with the airline's own customer service directives. Sutton removed her glasses, cleaned them with a cloth, put them back on. The motion took 6 seconds and communicated more than any verbal response could have. The particular patience of a professional who has heard this argument before and finds it inadequate, but will allow the record to reflect it. Noted. We'll address the question of whether de facto practice supersedes written protocol in our findings. Neville's portion of the hearing took 90 minutes. He was represented by a different union attorney, a sharper one named Baines, who had handled disciplinary cases involving corporate security personnel before and understood that the evidence fabrication allegation changed the temperature of the proceeding from administrative review to something closer to criminal exposure. The panel presented the overhead bin log. 2 entries by Pryor, J. The panel presented Pryor's sworn declaration describing the galley conversation, the phrase tangible reason, and the electronics pouch. Neville denied it. I never instructed any crew member to plant evidence. The suggestion is absurd. Ms. Pryor's declaration describes a specific conversation at approximately 2:45 p.m. in the first-class galley. Do you deny that conversation took place? I spoke with Ms. Pryor briefly during the pre-departure period. I don't recall the specific content. You don't recall telling her, quote, it would simplify things if there were a tangible reason to remove him. I don't recall that specific phrase. Baines leaned forward. My client has cooperated fully with this investigation. Ms. Pryor's recollection of a casual galley conversation, under the stress of a developing security situation, should not be treated as a verbatim transcript. The panel noted the denial. The panel also noted the Boston precedent, the texts Pryor had provided, the parallel incident 3 months earlier, the pattern that was emerging around Neville's name like iron filings around a magnet. Neville's expression during the Boston discussion was the expression of a man watching a wall develop, cracks he hadn't anticipated. The texts were specific. The Boston flight attendant's account corroborated Pryor's description of Neville's methodology. Not direct orders, but suggestions calibrated to provide plausible deniability while achieving the desired outcome. The panel took a 30-minute recess. When it reconvened, the remaining proceedings were brief. Pryor had submitted her declaration but was not present. She had accepted administrative leave voluntarily, pending the outcome, and had waived her right to a hearing appearance. Her representative submitted a written statement emphasizing her cooperation and the fact that the electronics pouch had been retrieved before any harm resulted. What the panel didn't know, what Hebert knew but hadn't yet shared, pending verification, was that Pryor's declaration included a detail about Margot Linden that complicated the narrative further. During the pre-departure period, while Margot was circulating through the cabin building her consensus against the man in 22C, Pryor had overheard her speaking on her cell phone in the first-class lavatory. The lavatory door hadn't latched properly. Margot's voice carried through the gap. I've already called the hotline. They're flagging him. No, I don't know what he did. That's not the point. He doesn't belong here, David. You should see him, the jacket, the bag. He looks like he walked in off the street. The words were in Pryor's declaration. She'd noted the approximate time, 2:51 p.m., and the fact that Margot had used the name David, presumably the person on the other end of the call. The significance was procedural. Margot's phone call confirmed that her complaint to the premium hotline had preceded any interaction with the man in 22C. She had not observed his behavior and then called. She had called first, reacted to his presence, his appearance, his existence in a space she'd determined he didn't belong in, and then spent the next 30 minutes constructing a social architecture to support a conclusion she'd reached before he'd done anything except sit down. The distinction mattered legally. A complaint based on observed behavior, even if the observation was subjective, had defensible standing. A complaint based on presence alone, on the reaction to a body in a space before that body had acted, was harder to characterize as anything other than what it was. Hebert added Pryor's lavatory observation to the file, made a note for the TSA referral. Complainant's own phone conversation, overheard by crew member, confirms complaint was based on appearance/presence rather than observed behavior. Timeline of complaint call precedes any possible behavioral observation. The hearing concluded at 4:17 p.m. The panel retired to deliberate. The deliberation took 3 days, longer than most internal reviews, shorter than the union representatives expected. The delay was caused by the Neville question, which had transformed a routine complaint review into something that required the airline's legal department to calculate exposure. The outcomes were announced on May 9th, 7 days after the hearing. Trent Holloway, suspended without pay for 14 days. Required to complete a mandatory retraining program titled Bias-Informed Passenger Interaction, developed by the airline's diversity office in partnership with an external civil rights consulting firm. The retraining consisted of 16 hours of coursework, including scenario-based exercises, implicit bias assessment, and a written examination. Holloway would return to duty upon completion. His record would reflect the suspension for 5 years, after which it could be expunged through standard administrative petition. Kirk Neville, terminated. The word sat in the findings document with the particular weight of a consequence that exceeded expectations. Not suspended, not reassigned. Terminated. The airline's legal department had reviewed the pattern evidence. The Kane flight, the Boston incident, the emerging documentation of a methodology that used suggestion and plausible deniability to manufacture justification for removing passengers, and concluded that Neville's conduct represented a systemic deviation from corporate security protocols that exposed the airline to significant legal liability. The termination was effective immediately. Neville's union filed a grievance within 48 hours. The grievance process would take 4 to 6 months. During that time, Neville would remain terminated, drawing no salary, while arbitrators reviewed whether the airline's decision met the just cause standard required by the collective bargaining agreement. Jeanette Pryor, continued administrative leave pending a separate investigation into the electronics pouch incident. The airline's legal department had determined that Pryor's conduct, while mitigated by her cooperation and the fact that the manufactured evidence was never deployed, warranted further review. Her declaration had been essential to the case against Neville, which created a complicated dynamic. The airline needed her testimony, but also needed to address her own actions. Her union filed a grievance immediately. The resolution was estimated at 3 to 6 months. The outcomes were not public. Internal disciplinary proceedings at private companies rarely are. They exist in the sealed space between the company's walls, visible only to the participants and the HR files that recorded them. But the outcomes leaked within 72 hours, the way outcomes always leak when they involve a story that has become public. An unnamed source within the airline's operations center provided a summary to a reporter at the News and Observer in Raleigh, who published an article on May 13th under the headline, "Airline Fires Security Liaison, Suspends Gate Agent After Veteran Removed from Flight." The article was 600 words. It contained the facts of the case, stripped of the overhead bin log, stripped of Pryor's electronics pouch, stripped of the nuance and institutional complexity that characterized the actual investigation. What remained was the skeleton, a black veteran removed from a flight based on a baseless complaint, an airline that eventually fired one employee and suspended another. The article was shared 93,000 times. It joined the video of Captain Mercer's salute in the public narrative of the incident, a narrative that was simpler and cleaner than the reality, as public narratives always are. The reality included union grievances and arbitration timelines, and a flight attendant on administrative leave whose cooperation had been essential, but whose own conduct was still under review. The public narrative included heroes and villains, and a salute and a viral video, and the satisfying arc of accountability. The reality and the narrative coexisted the way they always do. Parallel tracks that occasionally intersected but never fully merged. On the police side, the investigation moved at a different velocity. Airport Police Internal Affairs operated under different procedures, different timelines, different institutional pressures. The complaint against Sergeant Orbach, unauthorized physical contact, failure to identify upon request, was assigned to an IA investigator named Lieutenant Carla Dunn, who had reviewed 6 similar complaints in the previous 2 years. None had resulted in sustained findings. The standard was whether the officer's actions were consistent with department policy and reasonable under the circumstances. Dunn reviewed Orbach's body-worn camera footage. The footage was 38 minutes long, beginning when Orbach boarded the aircraft and ending when he returned to the police substation. The camera captured the encounter in the resolution that body cameras provide, high enough for faces and words, low enough that the subtleties of expression and tone were flattened into the indistinct visual language of institutional recording. The relevant segment: Orbach asks the passenger to step off the aircraft. The passenger declines. The passenger cites a federal statute. Orbach calls for backup. The passenger stands, reaches for the overhead bin. Orbach's hand closes around the passenger's forearm. The contact lasted approximately 4 seconds. The footage showed Orbach's hand gripping the forearm with enough pressure to halt the passenger's motion. The passenger's request, "Remove your hand," was audible. Orbach's release was visible. The passenger retrieved his bag and walked to the front of the aircraft without further physical incident. 4 seconds of contact. In the institutional calculus of police internal affairs, 4 seconds occupied a specific zone, long enough to be documented, short enough to be characterized as brief and incidental. Long enough that the passenger felt it, short enough that the officer could describe it as a stability assist or a guiding contact, the euphemisms that police departments had developed for physical interventions that fell below the threshold of use of force, but above the threshold of no contact. What the footage also captured, and what Dunn noted in her report but did not flag as a primary finding, was the passenger's response. The way his body froze when Orbach's hand closed around his arm. Not a flinch. Not a recoil. A freeze. The total cessation of motion that combat veterans exhibit when physical contact triggers a response pattern that the conscious mind must override before the trained response executes. Dunn had seen this in other encounters involving veterans. She understood, clinically, what it meant. The passenger's body had prepared for a defensive response that his conscious mind had suppressed. The suppression was itself an act of discipline that most civilians couldn't comprehend. The 4 seconds during which Orbach held the arm were 4 seconds during which a trained combat operator chose, actively and against instinct, not to react. Orbach himself had watched the footage during the IA process. He'd been required to review it as part of the investigation, seated in a conference room with Dunn and his union representative, watching himself on a screen that showed everything he'd done and everything the man in 22C had chosen not to do. His own face on the screen was the face of a man operating on institutional autopilot, following the sequence of actions that airport police training taught. Approach, instruct, escalate, if non-compliant, request backup, escalate further. The sequence was designed for situations involving actual threats. Applied to a man sitting quietly with a letter, the sequence looked like something else entirely. It looked like what it was, a system designed to process threats being applied to a person who wasn't one, by an officer who hadn't questioned whether the application was appropriate because the system hadn't required him to ask. Orbach had watched the screen in silence. His union representative had made notes. Dunn had asked him if he had any comments for the record. "I wish I'd asked better questions," Orbach said, "before I boarded the aircraft, before I put my hand on his arm. I wish I'd asked who filed the complaint and what specific behavior they were reporting. If I'd asked, I'd have known there was nothing to report, and none of this would have happened. The statement was not an apology. It was not an admission of wrongdoing. It was something rarer in the institutional vocabulary of police self-review, an acknowledgement that the system had a gap and that the officer had fallen through it. Dunn included the statement in her report. It didn't change the finding, but it changed the tone, from defensive compliance to something closer to reflection, the particular quiet that follows when a person realizes they were wrong and doesn't yet know what to do with the realization. Dunn's report, submitted on May 16th, found the complaint partially sustained. The physical contact was determined to be inconsistent with best practices for a compliant passenger encounter, but the report stopped short of finding a policy violation, noting that the department's use of contact policy did not explicitly address the scenario of a compliant passenger reaching for an overhead bin during a removal order. The finding on failure to identify was sustained. Department Policy 4.7.2 was clear. Officers were required to provide badge number and incident report information upon request during any enforcement action. Orbach had not provided either until after the encounter concluded. The policy violation was documented. The recommended discipline, a written reprimand. Mandatory completion of a 12-hour de-escalation training course. Removal from desk duty and return to regular patrol assignment. Orbach's union issued a statement expressing satisfaction with the finding and emphasizing that the officer had been exonerated of the primary complaint. Patricia Caldwell received a copy of the IA report on May 20th. She read it in her office, made 3 notes in the margin, and picked up the phone. Colonel Kane, Caldwell here. The airport police finding is in. Partially sustained. They got him on the ID failure but characterized the grab as inconsistent with best practices rather than a policy violation. Written reprimand and training. A pause on the line. The particular silence of a man who expected this outcome but had allowed himself to hope for something different. What are our options? We proceed with the civil track. The IA finding doesn't bind a federal court. We file under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, deprivation of rights under color of law. The body camera footage is our primary evidence. 4 seconds of unauthorized physical contact with a compliant passenger who had committed no violation. The standard in a 1983 action is whether a reasonable officer would have believed the contact was justified. I don't think a jury finds that it was. And Margot Linden? TSA investigation is still pending. 60 to 90-day review period. Separately, we've sent a demand letter citing 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, racial discrimination in contractual services. Her complaint to the airline's premium member line is recorded. The complaint cites no behavioral basis. The recording is clear. Has she responded? Through counsel. She denies racial motivation. Claims she was exercising her right as a passenger to report a safety concern. A safety concern she couldn't describe. Her attorney characterizes it as intuitive threat assessment. That's the phrase they're using. The phrase hung in the air the way legal euphemisms do, a construction designed to make something ugly sound technical, to give prejudice the vocabulary of expertise, to transform "I saw a black man and felt afraid" into something that could be argued before a judge without acknowledging what it actually meant. File the 1983, Kane said, and keep me informed on the TSA referral. Will do. One more thing. The DOT complaint. A civil rights organization filed a pattern or practice complaint citing your case along with 3 others. Same airline, different routes, different dates. Same pattern. Passengers of color removed or detained based on complaints with no behavioral basis. DOT's Office of Civil Rights has accepted the complaint for preliminary evaluation. What does preliminary evaluation mean? It means they're reading the file. It doesn't mean they're investigating. The gap between reading and investigating is measured in months, sometimes years. But the file exists now. The pattern is documented. And if the airline generates another incident while the file is open, The evaluation upgrades automatically." Kane thanked her, ended the call, sat in the apartment in Fayetteville where the electricity bill was late because the money had gone to a plane ticket, and looked at the fireproof box where 14 notebooks documented 31 years of being watched while watching. Volume 15 was on the kitchen table, open to the page where he'd recorded the final entry from March 16th. The overhead bin log, Pryor's retrieval of the item she'd planted and removed, the note that would become evidence in a case that was still growing. He closed the notebook, placed it in the box with the others. The box was heavy now, heavier than it had been when he started, heavier than any single incident warranted, heavy with the accumulated weight of a life spent being questioned by institutions that should have been grateful. He picked up the letter, the one he'd placed on Raymond's casket, now returned to him by the cemetery staff who'd found it during the burial. The wind hadn't taken it after all. The words had held. He folded it along its creases, put it in the jacket pocket. The pocket that held everything important, the notebook, the letter, the case reference, the folded boarding pass from a flight that had changed the trajectory of a Tuesday afternoon, and possibly, though the evidence was incomplete and the timeline uncertain, the trajectory of a policy or two at an airline that served 14 million passengers a year and had never stopped to count how many of them had been treated the way it treated Desmond Kane. On May 23rd, the airline issued a public statement. The statement had been drafted by the Public Affairs Department, reviewed by legal, approved by the Chief Operating Officer, and released through the company's official channels with the careful timing of a Friday afternoon, the traditional burial ground of corporate announcements that companies want noticed but not examined too closely. We are committed to ensuring every passenger is treated with dignity and respect regardless of background. We have initiated enhanced training protocols across our customer-facing operations and are cooperating fully with all ongoing investigations. We take these matters seriously and are dedicated to continuous improvement in our service standards. 73 words. The statement did not mention Desmond Kane by name, did not mention the word profiling, did not acknowledge that a passenger had been removed from an aircraft based on a complaint that cited no behavior, did not reference the termination of Kirk Neville or the suspension of Trent Holloway or the administrative leave of Jeanette Pryor or the body-worn camera footage showing a police sergeant grabbing a compliant veteran's arm. 73 words that said everything the airline wanted to say and nothing that needed saying. Patricia Caldwell read the statement and made one note in her case file. Statement is nonspecific, non-apologetic, and references no concrete remedial actions, useful as evidence of institutional posture in potential trial proceedings. Vernon Pace read the statement in the same News and Observer article that reported it and wrote a second letter. This one to the editor, shorter and sharper than the first. The airline's statement about dignity and respect would be more convincing if they had shown dignity and respect to the man they removed from their aircraft. Training protocols are not accountability. Cooperating with investigations is not the same as initiating them, and continuous improvement is a phrase companies use when they want to sound like they're changing without actually committing to change anything specific. The letter was published on May 27th. It was shared 18,000 times. On June 1st, Desmond Kane returned Jeanette Pryor's phone call. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. It was not recorded. Kane was not yet in a legal posture that required recording, and Pryor had specifically asked to speak without documentation. What Kane shared with Caldwell afterward, in a call that was documented by attorney-client privilege, was the substance of what Pryor had told him. She was sorry. She had been wrong. She had placed the electronics pouch on his bag, and she had intended to use it to justify his removal, and she had removed it only when the crew's attitude shifted. She wanted him to know that she was cooperating with the investigation, that she had identified Neville's pattern, and that she had evidence, texts, emails, a group chat among flight attendants, that documented a culture within the airline's security apparatus that used passenger profiling as a management tool and manufactured evidence when profiling alone couldn't produce the desired outcome. She also wanted him to know something else. Something that would become the final breadcrumb in a trail that had started with a boarding pass and ended in a conference room on the 4th floor of an airline's operations center. The group chat included a message from Neville, sent 4 months before the Kane incident, that read, "Premium Pack's complaints about minority passengers should be handled with enhanced responsiveness. These are our revenue base. Document accordingly." Document accordingly. The instruction that transformed bias into procedure. The 2 words that gave prejudice an institutional infrastructure and allowed individuals to implement it while maintaining the fiction that they were simply following directives. Pryor had saved screenshots of the message. She'd saved them not out of foresight, but out of the particular unease that comes from receiving an instruction that feels wrong but comes from someone with authority. The unease that doesn't rise to the level of refusal, but produces the instinct to preserve evidence, just in case. Just in case the wrongness eventually matters, just in case someone eventually asks. Someone was asking now. Caldwell reviewed the screenshots. The message was time-stamped November 8, 2025. The group chat included 7 participants, all flight attendants and security liaisons assigned to the airline's East Coast operations. Neville's message was preceded by a discussion about a complaint from a business-class passenger on a New York to Miami flight. The passenger, identified in the chat only by seat number, not name, had complained about a man in economy whose luggage didn't match the airline's typical passenger profile. The complaint had resulted in a bag search that found nothing, and a passenger who filed a formal objection that was quietly settled for a $500 travel voucher and a non-disclosure agreement. $500. The institutional price tag for suspicion without cause, less than a first-class ticket on the same route. The pattern was not subtle. It was, in fact, remarkably well documented, preserved in text messages and group chats and overhead bin logs and premium hotline recordings, the particular evidence trail that accumulates when people behave badly inside systems that record everything but review almost nothing. The evidence existed because no one had ever expected it to matter, because the people generating it believed, with the quiet confidence of institutional insulation, that their internal communications were as private as their intentions. They were wrong. Caldwell added the message to the DOT filing. The preliminary evaluation was upgraded to an active review on June 15th. The active review would take months, possibly longer. The DOT's Office of Civil Rights was understaffed, overworked, and processing complaints at a rate that guaranteed nothing except delay. But the file was active. The pattern was documented. The evidence was accumulating mass. And somewhere in the machinery, someone would eventually have to decide whether the pattern was an aberration or a feature, whether what happened to Desmond Kane was the failure of a system or the system working exactly as designed. On June 10th, Trent Holloway completed his 14-day suspension and his 16-hour retraining program. He passed the written examination with a score of 84%. He was cleared to return to duty at RDU. He badged into the employee entrance on a Tuesday morning, walked to gate C-17, the same gate, by coincidence or by scheduling software that didn't account for irony, logged into the podium system, pulled up the day's manifest. The first flight of his shift was a 10:15 a.m. departure to Charlotte. Boarding would begin in 40 minutes. He stood at the podium and reviewed the passenger list with the particular attention of a man who had recently learned that attention had consequences. 16 hours of retraining played in his head, scenarios and statistics, and the uncomfortable vocabulary of bias assessment that he had absorbed without fully accepting, the way patients swallow medicine they don't believe in because the doctor said to. Zone 4 was called. Passengers filed through the boarding lane in the standard choreography of ID checks and boarding pass scans and the small negotiations over carry-on size and bin space. Routine. Normal. The machinery of air travel operating the way it was designed to operate. efficiently, impersonally, without the particular friction that arises when the machinery's human components introduce variables the system wasn't built to handle. A young black woman approached the podium. Late 20s, business attire, rolling carry-on, boarding pass on her phone. She scanned it. The machine beeped green. She moved toward the jetway. Holloway looked at her, looked at the boarding pass, looked at her again. His hand moved toward the radio, then stopped. He handed back the phone, looked at her face. Something moved behind his expression. The war between habit and training, between instinct and the institutional memory of what instinct had cost him 14 days of pay and a permanent note in his personnel file. "Have a good flight," he said. She walked down the jetway without looking back. She had no reason to look back. She didn't know about the radio, didn't know about the hand, didn't know about the 14 days or the retraining or the man in the worn field jacket who had sat in row 22 and changed the weight of a gate agent's habits. She didn't know that 15 minutes ago, when Holloway had logged into the podium system and seen the gate assignment, C-17, the same gate, his stomach had tightened with a sensation that the retraining materials would call cognitive association, and that Holloway himself would simply call remembering. Remembering the radio call he'd made, remembering the flag he'd entered with no behavioral basis, remembering the word appearance in his field notes, and the way that word had been read back to him in the hearing room by a woman in wire-rimmed glasses who'd cleaned them while waiting for him to explain something he couldn't explain. He remembered the colonel walking down the jetway for the second time, walking back to his seat after the police had found nothing because there was nothing to find. The colonel hadn't looked at Holloway as he passed, hadn't given him the satisfaction of anger or the relief of confrontation, had simply walked past, the way you walk past furniture, and that absence of acknowledgement had been worse than any words could have been because it communicated, with devastating precision, that Holloway didn't matter enough to be angry at. He remembered all of it. Standing at the same podium, looking at the same jetway entrance, processing passengers through the same bottleneck where he'd once decided that a man in an old jacket didn't belong on an airplane. And now a young black woman was walking through that bottleneck, and his hand had moved toward the radio, and his hand had stopped, and the question of why it stopped was the only question that mattered, and the only question he couldn't answer. Holloway watched her go. His hand dropped to his side. The podium screen showed the next passenger in the queue. He pressed the scan button. The line moved. Whether his hesitation was conscience or caution, whether he'd stopped because something in him had changed, or because something in the system had made the cost of not changing too high, the story doesn't say. The story doesn't know. The distinction between internal transformation and external compliance is one that only the person inside can feel, and Trent Holloway had not yet decided which one applied to him. The gate agent at the adjacent podium, a woman Holloway had worked beside for 3 years, glanced at him. She'd been at C-19 during the original incident. She'd heard the radio call. She'd watched the police board the aircraft. She'd watched the video afterward, like everyone else in the RDU operations staff, in the break room, on someone's phone, in the silence that follows when colleagues recognize that something irreversible has happened to someone they work with. She didn't say anything, just glanced, and returned to her own screen. But his hand had stopped. That was something. Not enough, maybe. Not the systemic change that the DOT review might or might not produce. Not the policy reform that the viral video had demanded and the airline's 73-word statement had declined to commit to. Not justice. If justice meant certainty and completeness and the confident resolution that stories are supposed to deliver, but life rarely does. But something. A hand that moved toward a radio and stopped. A man who thought about reaching and chose not to reach. A moment of hesitation in the vast, indifferent machinery of a system that processed 14 million passengers a year and had never, until 6 weeks ago, been forced to examine what happened when one of those passengers sat too quietly in coach while wearing the wrong face in the wrong jacket. The gate closed. The aircraft pushed back. The jetway retracted. And 600 miles south, in an apartment in Fayetteville, where the electricity bill had finally been paid, a retired colonel sat at a kitchen table with a notebook and a letter, and the particular stillness of a man who had spent his life carrying others and was learning, slowly and without any certainty, that the lesson would hold, that sometimes the carrying was noticed, not always, not by everyone, not with the speed or completeness that sacrifice deserved, but noticed. The notebook was closed. The letter was in the jacket pocket. The case was filed. The investigation was active. The outcomes were pending, partial, uncertain. The particular shape of progress in a country that built monuments to service in marble and conducted its daily encounters in the more provisional materials of policy and procedure, and the fragile, exhaustible willingness of individuals to do better than the institutions they served. The phone sat on the table beside the notebook. No new voicemails. No calls from Caldwell. No updates from TSA or DOT or the airline's internal affairs division. The silence of systems processing. The quiet of institutions examining themselves at the precise speed that allows examination without urgency. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the railing of the back porch, a flash of red against the gray wood, there for a moment and then gone. Desmond watched it arrive and depart with the steady attention of a man who had trained himself to notice everything, even beauty, even in the gaps between battles. He picked up the notebook, opened it to a fresh page, wrote the date, left the rest of the page blank. Some days had no entries. Some days were just the date and the silence and the knowledge that somewhere, in some conference room or government office or airline operations center, people were reading files that documented what it cost to be a black man in a field jacket on a Tuesday afternoon in America. The files would generate memos. The memos would generate meetings. The meetings would generate outcomes that someone would call resolution and someone else would call insufficient, and most people would eventually forget. But the files existed. The evidence existed. The salute existed, preserved in a video that had been watched by 4 million people and counting. A moment of honor made visible inside a larger story of dishonor that the country was still learning how to read. And in a cemetery in Arlington, beneath 6 feet of earth and a white marble headstone, a letter rested on a casket. The wind had not taken it. The words had held. "I'll carry you one more time, Ray. One more time." The promise had been kept. The carrying continued.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.